Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This episode is a special episode, kind of taking a slight detour from my usual weekly-ish episodes I try to post, and bringing a very long form, and I know that's saying something for most of my episodes, but a very long form, in-depth discussion about my guest's recent thesis that he just finished, and we decided to jump on a conversation and just get into the weeds of it. So I have for you Tyler VanOstrand again. So Tyler, for those of you that have listened to some of the episodes, he was my very first guest, and we talked about in that episode Freud more generally. We talked about Heraclitus, and we talked about a little bit of Nietzsche kind of as an introduction. And in the back half of that, or towards the end actually of that episode, he had mentioned he was working on a thesis and he wanted to come back on and share all of the things he's really been thinking about for years that he finally compiled into a master's thesis, which he has finished. So he sent it to me and I read it and a couple times, and I said, listen, you gotta honor what we had discussed doing on the first time you came on, and come back on and talk about it and take it as long as it needs to. And he said, absolutely, and it'd be good practice for me, as he has to defend some of this stuff. And so I was itching to do this. Freud and Nietzsche are some of my favorite thinkers, as is for Tyler. So, we really revere these guys, and, but we also, I think, we try to be very critical as well. So hopefully that comes out in the conversation. This conversation is very long. So it is almost 4 hours. And, I told Tyler before we decided to do it, I said, listen, I don't really even care. I mean, I want everyone to listen to it, but I said, if no one listens to it, fine, man. The fact that we had this conversation in a structured way, got really, really deep into these ideas. We have it, documented. We have it recorded, which is super cool. So, again, this is kind of why it's a sort of a special episode. We're kind of going over, we didn't have it, pulled up on, our screens and just going line by line of his thesis, but it is kind of centered around that. So, it is a little bit different. That's why it's kind of a special episode, or special edition, if you will, kind of to the podcast. So I'm going to be doing a few of those, trying out different things. We're going to do stuff like this, and a few other surprises, in the near future. So be on the lookout for that. Okay. So to the episode itself. So Tyler's thesis was on, basically how many people, and we get into this, but many people see Nietzsche as kind of the progenitor for Freud and Freud's thought, right? So Nietzsche came first, he had all these ideas, and then Freud just structured it and made it more clinical, and is still used today in clinical practice. And it's very easy to draw that line. There is a lot of, if you're taking a cursory reading of Nietzsche and in a cursory reading of Freud, they talk a lot about, this unconscious, and they talk about drives, and they talk about instincts, and kind of ways of reducing things. And it would seem on the surface very much similar. And, I think Tyler probably thought that for a while. I've thought that for a while. And then, Tyler really wanted to push himself and challenge himself and say, okay, where are these guys different if they are? And so he did kind of a really in-depth analysis of their stuff and their thought. And he, formulated his, thesis around how they are actually dissimilar in important ways, which, not a lot of people talk about that, at least in the secondary sources that I've read. So here's what we got into in this episode. So in the beginning, we structured the interview, or your conversation really. The first 25, 30 minutes, of this episode is just Tyler giving pretty much a long summary of his thesis. Talks about how they view life and death, how they view will to power and tension reduction, how do they view the different instincts and drives, eternal recurrence of the same, and, kind of introductory historical stuff, and then a conclusion. So he gives a nice summary of the juxtaposition of their ideas. We spent probably a good hour on will to power. I mean, this is a central key component of Nietzsche's thought. You can't really understand Nietzsche unless you understand will to power. He talks about it in all of his writings, especially later Nietzsche, and some of it is, not as there's definitely pieces of it that are left underdeveloped. So because he died. So, but in the episode we talk about the basic definition and the components of will to power as an active idea. It's a very activating force. It's pushing towards something. We talk about the dimensions and extensions of will to power and how they work. We talked about will to power that sits nestled within a superstructure and hierarchy. It doesn't just, leave hanging out of that. We talk about will to power as having a type of purpose, or probably more accurately, some directionality. We spent a healthy amount talking about will to power as observational and descriptive analysis primarily, but also some of the, I guess you could say, implicit prescriptive elements as well. We didn't talk about Freud's take on this, right? Freud, his formulation of life and death idea is more passive. So if you have will to power as an active ingredient, Freud sees his ideas as more of a passive one, this tension reduction, right? And for Freud, tension reduction is a sort of essence of life and how it works. We spent a good deal of time on later Freud, so on the death instinct, and how the death instinct is a primary way to return to primordial origins. So we talk about what that means in the episode. And then how Freud and then Darwin interact. And then also Nietzsche and Darwin interact and some of the differences. We talk about the role of sex with tension reduction as part of the life instinct. And then we look at this divergence of, okay, for Freud, it's tension reduction. And for Nietzsche, it's this expenditure of power through the will to power. And how do those look differently, right? Both Freud and Nietzsche are talking about energy, right? They're talking about this kind of force of life, but they're talking about it, one in an active, one in a passive way. And then how does that translate in how they view things? We spent a little bit of time on the misreading of Nietzsche by Deleuze and Derrida, and how they basically read Nietzsche up until difference, and then they kind of do their own thing, and they never get to the surpassing, which is the next step in Nietzsche's will to power concept. So we talk about some of the misreadings of Nietzsche and some of the problems with that. We talk about the aspect of pleasure and pain within the instincts and how Freud and Nietzsche understand them, somewhat differently. And then we towards the end, we talk about the eternal recurrence of the same. And this is a complicated concept, and once you get into it, and so we talk about some of the nuances. And then Tyler gives a nice summary of all the topics that we covered over this very long conversation. And, as I was listening to it again and thinking about it, we kind of towards the end, we're like, okay, so what do we do with this, right? Why do we study this? Why do we think about this? And we give a few ideas about that and some open-endedness to that. But, I have to say that, Tyler is a good interlocutor of this stuff, but he's just super brilliant. He's sharp mind. He has such a good way of explaining and teaching and dialoguing and interacting with Nietzsche. I talk to a lot of really awesome, smart people, and I just always feel like there's something missing when they do an analysis of Nietzsche. And Tyler seems to really get at the core of it, and that's special, and I really value and appreciate that. So yeah, I hope you guys do as well. I hope for people that want to casually criticize, either Nietzsche or Freud, can listen to this very in-depth discussion of their ideas and be curious enough to say, let me go back and revisit these guys, and let me go read them carefully and try to understand what's going on. That would be, a wonderful outcome if someone's taking the time to listen to this conversation for me. So hopefully it behooves you as a listener, to listen or rather read these guys again if you haven't, or want to revisit them, and I hope you enjoy the episode as long as it is, and look forward to everybody's comments. So now I bring you Tyler VanOstrand. I am here with Tyler VanOstrand again. Tyler has been so generous to come on and talk with me about a bunch of his writing and his studies and everything he's been doing the past couple months since I had him on. So thanks for coming on again, man.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me again. I'm excited to be your first and your first repeat guest.
Yeah, first repeat. You're just knocking all the firsts.
Yeah.
So I guess it was October or November. I can't remember when it was end of October, early November when I had you on the first time.
Yeah.
Awesome conversation. I really loved it. Some of the feedback I've got is people have said that they liked it too. So that's great. It's always nice to get good feedback about it. And I know when we had talked, I had said something along the lines of, okay, well, get this thesis done, and then we'll get you back on here, and you can tell us about it. And so here we are. This is kind of the big point of it. So I have all the time to get into this. I think it's really good. I've read it a few times, and so I want to just dive deep into the ideas. So why don't you just start by maybe giving us a really, a summary, of what it is and all the ideas, and kind of give us kind of all the big stuff, and then we'll get into the details.
Cool. Yeah. Well, to start out, I will give a summary, mostly reading, kind of an amalgamation of my intro and conclusion, which I've kind of bulleted a little bit and shortened. But this will give you a sense of what I cover and what I'm arguing throughout the thesis.
Okay.
Yeah. So to begin, Nietzsche and Freud have arrived in modern day, in the 21st century, with opposing fates, and this is a reversal that touches on a couple other reversals we'll see, which is really interesting. The immoralist, Nietzsche's own epithet, approaches his highest time now. Nietzsche studies are really taking off. And simultaneously, the father of the talking cure, psychoanalysis, has been reduced via the accusation of reduction, which, interestingly enough, I'll go on to argue a completely different type of reduction for Freud, by which I think he should be surpassed, to use a Nietzschean term. But due to the subtlety and rigor of their theories, both of these thinkers are very complex, very subtle. The rising popularity for Nietzsche and the dismissal of Freud largely emerged from superficial conceptions of their work, as I say in the paper, constructed with the aim to manage and not wrestle these psychic titans. There are volumes of great scholarship on these thinkers. I've read almost all of them in writing this. But few approach Nietzsche as psychologist and Freud as philosopher. That is to say, their formulations are rarely placed on what I like to call common turf. And something you see instantly that Nietzsche would certainly despise is, in these works, which go all the way back to Thomas Mann and some people in the early turn of the century, the mantra Nietzsche as forerunner dominates their exploration. Right, so Nietzsche is he's always immediately cast in a psychoanalytic light only, which is to say, he's falsified, he's reduced and seen only in that sense. And so when you look at Nietzsche as forerunner, you end up with a huge amount of holes, trying to think him in a psychoanalytic problematic. So the most essential distinction, you could say relation, or if I were writing this again, I would have said here inversion, is often overlooked because of this framing, this psychoanalytic framing of the comparison. So while Nietzsche and Freud established similar nodal points, you might say, that relate to the central pillars of their psychic formulations, they constructed, they configured these pillars in diametrically opposed ways. Freud forming, and I like to think of this as building a structure. I mean, I'm a carpenter by trade, and I like to think of these systems of thought in this structural way. And so Freud is forming with these pillars that often align with Nietzsche. He's forming a passive structure, a structure that is ever retreating, a model of life and psyche that is, at best, reactive. It never approaches this pure activity. On the other hand, Nietzsche has constructed an active, eternally advancing conception of life, psyche, and cosmos. Right? For Nietzsche, we're dealing with a cosmology. For Freud, he's thinking very much from the psyche downward, you might say. Nietzsche's thinking really from outside of the universe inward, you might say. A very different view, but again, they're touching on the same points. So in my thesis, I really made an effort to separate Nietzsche and Freud. Right? And this is at the expense of their, many similarities, as I've said. And, a whole nother thesis could be written just on that. And many good books have been written on that. In fact, that's what comes out in the work that's been done. All people have focused on, given Nietzsche as progenitor or forerunner of psychoanalysis, or as Mann put it, Thomas Mann, I think he says, Freud gave, scientific rigor to Nietzsche's formulations, something like that. Mm-hmm. But all those explorations bring out is there's similarities because that's what they're looking for. How could Nietzsche help out psychoanalysis? But in this thesis, I'm trying to do something I haven't seen done, and I don't think it's really been done. Maybe there's a paper or two, and that is to separate them. So I'm emphasizing, not quite to the point of pushing it beyond its boundaries, their inversion, their opposition. And I'm focusing primarily at the kernel of their theories. So I'm trying to go back to the very essence, the start of life, in its most fundamental form. So in doing this and trying to separate Nietzsche and Freud, and I said this in our last podcast, mm-hmm. I'm trying to separate Nietzsche and Freud with the intention of developing, or with the hope of then being able to develop a kind of genuinely Nietzschean psychology, which, mm-hmm. Over the last century has just been tainted and seen only through the lens of Freud. So I examined in this thesis Nietzsche's complex role in the conceptual development of psychoanalysis. I juxtapose Freud's passive or reactive psychic model with Nietzsche's active cosmology. I explore their conceptions of life, death, and instinct. And lastly, I compare their presentations and applications of repetition and return. Now, so quickly, I'd like to go through and kind of summarize these different sections that I developed in the thesis.
Yeah, please.
And just to touch on this first, I know we did this a little bit in our last discussion, but the historical developmental piece is important, and I think it also helps to frame the whole discussion.
Yeah, I agree.
And in another way too, helps to separate this type of comparison from the comparisons that have been done before. Nietzsche as forerunner, period. Moving from that point. So, it's certainly fair to say that Nietzsche paved the way for Freud in many respects. I mean, that's undeniable. But his role in the development of psychoanalysis is really complex, and I think parallels exactly, almost in an eerie sort of manner, the relationship between their actual philosophy or psychology. So the posthumously named forerunner of analysis was, on the one hand, intimidating to Freud. He represented, especially in his early career, as he was, just kind of studying and psychoanalysis was percolating in his unconscious, you might say. Freud represented an inaccessible nobility. Nietzsche represented an inaccessible nobility to Freud. That is, and it's interesting too, because this is it seems disingenuous when you really take a full view of their interaction, or you probably should say Freud's interaction with Nietzsche's thought. He in no way treats him as noble, except in the sense that you might want to stay away from the noble because they in some way might harm you. So in this way, he was seen as nobility, but as Freud developed his theories, Nietzsche was seen as a competitor, really, an obstacle to be avoided. And I didn't get into this in the thesis, but a whole lot could be written on Nietzsche and Freud as competitor, or really as opponents, especially in Freud's mind, right? I mean, Freud meant nothing to Nietzsche, but when Freud came along, when Freud was developing psychoanalysis, Nietzsche was huge. He was really starting to take off, to the extent that the majority of the early practitioners of psychoanalysis, Jung, we could think of a ton of them. All of these guys, Thomas Mann, Fliess, they were all, in many respects, Nietzscheans. And so it's interesting to see how Freud handles Nietzsche, you might say, as he's developing psychoanalysis, in comparison to the estimation of Nietzsche and the kind of integration or attempted integration of Nietzsche's work going on with his proteges everywhere. Freud ignored Nietzsche. They were kind of obsessed with it. And so in this sense, it set up this competition. And so Freud, who read very little of his progenitor, was by and large repelled by Nietzsche, right? This nobility repelled him. So while the philosopher preferred to view the inner dimension intuitively from the heights, this is kind of Nietzsche's approach. Freud, especially Nietzsche, would say, relegated himself to the quote unquote subterranean domain, forming a psychology of the degenerate. And that's certainly what Nietzsche's critique would be, at the very least. And in a parallel opposition, perhaps also as unspoken, Freud dismissed the sage of Sils Maria on account of his premonitions and insights, which Freud concluded were far too insightful in form, not so much content, to have come from a healthy mind, Freud said.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, Nietzsche's insights were too non-psychoanalytically derived to be derived from a healthy person. So he terms Nietzsche, a neurotic, a one-of-a-kind neurotic, who he said, no one has ever had the introspective insight that Nietzsche has, nor is it likely to ever happen again. And by this, he goes on to say this is essentially an illness. Nietzsche has some kind of crazy access. He has this monstrous lucidity to his unconscious symbolism, and so in this sense, Freud said that was the way by which he was able to develop his insights. In other words, no one else healthy could ever do this, and no one else will, likely, he says. That is, we must stay in psychoanalysis and the method I'm developing. That's the only way to do it. Again, you see this opposition sticking out here.
Mm-hmm.
And the divergence that emerged from, and or you could say before, this methodological, temperamental, developmental opposition lies at the plexus of the Nietzsche-Freud inversion, the distinction between the expenditure of energy and the reduction of tension.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really the key. This is the terminus qua, the point of departure. It manifests in their doctrine of the drives, instincts,
Mm-hmm.
the deciphering of the instincts, kind of their approach, and this founds their point of arrival, you could say. A metapsychology of the death drive on one hand, against a psychic genealogy of the will to power on the other. And so, just setting this up, you can see again, if you pay close attention to, the way that's unfolded, it mirrors perfectly on really what I think is a careful critique or comparison of their relationship as theorists, primarily as psychologists. So to go into the first point related to their actual theorizing, life and death, and this is really what turned me on to this whole topic, is again looking at this very essence, this very kernel of their theories, because life and death are crucial for both of these theorists, perhaps more so than any other.
Mm-hmm.
Life and death is the most telling opposition, the most revealing opposition between these theorists. Their positions are really antithetical. For Freud, life is a reactive, longing to be passive, limiting, reductive state that ultimately serves to lengthen the course toward death, its very own manner of destruction or cessation. Whereas life is a purely active overplus, a rare expression of the will to power that strives, along with the cosmos, for the accumulation and expenditure of circumstantial energetic strength. So, far from Freud's exaggerated exterior, and we'll get into that, Nietzsche's life is itself a manifestation of the cosmic principle, right? This interior force, an amalgamation of similarly configured or conjoined wills. And therefore, life is built by and sustained upon the active exploitation of other life as a basic organic function, as a consequence of the will to power. And we'll unpack that, right? That therefore is dependent upon the very nature of will to power itself, which he goes on to say is, after all, the will to life. An equal and proportional divide regarding death emerges between the same comparison on life. Theoretically speaking, death is primarily valorized by Freud and secondarily utilized by Nietzsche. And that distinction is really important. And you can find the same type of proportional emphases in an inversion of this regarding life for these thinkers. The deathward tendency, tension reduction, is essential to life for Freud and is, in many respects, life itself, right? That action, the action of tension reduction, that process is really the life process. And by that, I don't mean life as in eros or reproductive.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this tension reduction is the essence of life itself for Freud, because life is fundamentally the reaction against excess excitation and development, or Nietzsche would say becoming. Since death is the inevitable result, Freud says, or the effect of life, and you can see there where he's placing his kind of assumed priorities. The analyst reasoned it must be life's goal. So since death is the inevitable result, much like Schopenhauer argued, it must be life's goal. Mm-hmm. So he's describing something like a quasi teleology. Mm-hmm. So is Nietzsche. One is going backwards, one is going forward. I mean, their opposition is very stark here. Nietzsche views death, in contrast, as the completion of physiological degeneration, or for the rare noble soul who dies at the right time, a final display and investment of will to power, as he says, in an air and a goal. The cosmic urge for the accumulation and expenditure of power reigns in death too, right? In the act of death, or in the process of death, it's still will to power, and it's still activity, because the energetic winding down of the whole is caused by the increased autonomy, circumstantial power of the particular wills therein, right? The ones that compose this body store of energy. Or put negatively, a lack of vitality causes degeneration, not the reverse. Mm-hmm. And this is a subtle point that is an interesting, necessary conclusion of many of Nietzsche's formulations. For instance, when you die, it's not because you got sick, or you could say you were sick before you became ill, something like that. The degeneration always precedes the illness. The body itself, or the particular wills to power therein, are never themselves ill. There is only an ill organization, Nietzsche might say, or an ill structure, hierarchy, in the psyche, and that is what leads to death, not in the psyche per se. That leads to degeneration in life and behavior, but in the life form, it's degeneration that precedes death. So there's this interesting chicken and egg thing there that would be fun to tease out. Moving to instinct, the death drive is repetition and return, and among other things, engenders what Freud considers the conservatism of the instincts as regressive, reductive urge, or mechanistically biological inertia. The nihilistic, reductive mode of being was present from the dawn of life, Freud says, and paradoxically stands as its essence, that which strives to equalize tension and return to a state of lifelessness. He's always talking about this return to the peace of the inanimate. So even the reproductive cells adhere to the reductive, conservative nature of Freudian instinct by hearkening back, or as Zarathustra would say, willing backward to an earlier condition, ardently resisting development in an effort to conserve the reductive condition of life itself. And, that gets kind of complicated, but it's crucial. There's so much retreat and reversion in repetition And repetition is so essential to every aspect of Freudian psychology. So, and I mean that both in a clinical aspect and also in a structural aspect.
Yeah.
Nietzsche, however, conceives this instinct as the will to power formed into cohesive, magnified impulses. Right? And this is very organically based, you might say, that animate the living organism, always as a propellant toward, and by temporal extension, a propellant forward. There is no instinct of return for Nietzsche, no innate tendency toward homeostatic rest. Such seeming neutrality and inertia is only reached in a state of decay, which refers more to an energetic cohesion than to a total energetic reduction. Or you might say, winding down is really a winding apart for Nietzsche. That's what death is. It's not a death of will to power or a passivity. It's really a separation, a decohesion of these constituent wills. This landscape of force, will to power, relates every organic, including psychic function, along with our whole instinctual life, to the one fundamental form of will to power, thus proving even the right, as Nietzsche says, to determine that all animate and inanimate forces are developments and derivations of the one cosmic principle, the will to power. And just to integrate all of that into my last section, my last movement of the paper, which in and of itself is really going to capture their whole separation in a practical, or you could say rubber meets the road sort of way. So coming to the notion of return,
Right.
We see that repetition was, for Freud, a plaguing phantom of repression and return, right? We always hear of the return of the repressed. And return is really, in the repetition compulsion, the essence of the death drive for Freud. But for Nietzsche, return is the temporal essence of the universe, that if grasped and embraced, marks the high point of the individual and the zenith of his philosophy, psychology. As he describes it, form and mechanistic change, temporal law and psychological canon gracefully forced beneath one yoke. There's a lot there to unpack. In a further Heraclitean opposition, Freud posited a positive return, right? And this is, I'm doing an inversion here. Freud posited a positive return in the essential conservatism of the instincts, right? It's a good thing. They want to return. It's good insofar as they wish to go back. And they're fitted to resist development. Hence, their reactivity is always a hearkening backward, a passivity, even in activity, development, growth. Nietzsche, however, presented the inverse, a negative wish to return in psychic degeneration, the wish to rest, to flee, to preserve, the last man, the wish at the heart of all morality, that no one harm me, which is to say, the wish, kind of a bottom tier will to power, that rejects the cosmos as eternal shifting power differentials itself, right? Its will to power rejecting itself. Fechner's tendency towards stability, upon which the pleasure principle for Freud was derived, Freud's homeostatic state toward which the pleasure principle is always striving, could never be achieved or held in the Nietzschean cosmos. And so consequently, and this is really harsh, but I think true, the death drive that presses toward the state of neutrality for Freud, that state of inanimate peace, pursues a nihilistic fantasy in Freudian terms. Will to somnambulance, or you could say will to reduction. It's this desire to sleep. Nietzsche says quite a bit about it. And contrary to, and this is where I'll end, contrary to the unbending of the neurotic repressive loop through the repetition and exhaustion of transferential material, which again we can get into unpacking that. This is talking about the actual practice of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalytic therapy is based on this exhaustion of transferential material, where you're constantly forcing what is repressed into memory, right? This loops backward, just all of these loops. Nietzsche, however, elevated this notion of return, you could say a loop, to an alloy of opposed ideals worthy of reverence and worship. Right? And he does this by saying it's a Platonic form and also a mechanistic ideal. Both of them as ideals merged into one, kind of a merging of Plato and Newton. And and so in this sense, he's trying to engulf with the eternal return all of the things between Plato and Newton, which is everything. It's a brilliant formulation. So he says the eternal return, or return itself, really, an idea worthy of reverence and worship, the necessary conclusion of finitude in eternal motion, and the structural temporal imposition by which every possible configuration of will to power is aesthetically justified. This is very Heraclitean. Applied as a powerful conception that can provide calibration and motivation, the eternal return of the same simultaneously nullifies the sting of resentment. This is that application. And this is kind of a double return here. Nullifies the sting of resentment, that willing backward, and prods one to advance dangerously and prodigally through life, and grants the context, perspective, and consolation that can be offered only by the affirmation of all too eternal cyclicity. So I'll stop there. That really, I think, is summarizing everything I have in my thesis, and hopefully we can go through and unpack a bunch of that, leaving out this historical piece, which I think I covered enough.
Yeah. So I was gonna say that was brilliant. That was great. That was a very nice was that 25 minutes summary of but yeah, basically your whole thesis, but then kind of the highlights and the big points. And so I think it's great that for anyone that listens can say, oh, okay, I have the broad version of all the other things we'll get into and find out all of that. But you hit all the big points, and there seems to be a very clear delineation between Freud's, because Freud and Nietzsche are touching on the same things, or they're talking about the same things in some similar ways. But I think what your major thesis statement is that there are significant differences once you understand their respective philosophies and worldviews on their own merits. Then there's this, oh, okay, and then you start to see some of the difference. So that was great. That was fantastic. Okay, so let's jump into let's talk about the first, I guess, point, which would be the whole concepts of that both of them have with life, death, and how intention reduction, and how they look at that. We were talking recently, and I had said that will to power is reaching forward, and Freud's tension reduction is reaching backwards. So I guess based on what you summarized, what I want to get into is kind of again, just to not to be too redundant, but let's talk about some of the terms, and then as we define the terms, then we can talk about the more specific ideas. So let's do, you mentioned it, but let's tell us about will to power and what that is, and we'll start general and then get very specific.
Yeah. Well, will to power in its most essential form, and really, I suppose that's all Nietzsche gives us. Will to power is this urge, drive, you might say, force, could be another way of saying it.
Hmm.
Very internal, right? This is, as Nietzsche says, the inner dimension of force, which he says has never been described, only this outer manifestation of force. But Nietzsche says this inner dimension of force is really where things are coming from. It's really where force comes from, not from this outside type of thing. It's not really a production of, it's not it's not a product of movement or weight, so to speak. It proceeds from within. And that goes for everything in the cosmos itself. And it's this mass of undulating uh, differentials of force. So for Nietzsche, will to power is essentially the urge to accumulate and expend energy. But you'd have to amend to that it's always a seeking toward more intensity, toward more power. So whereas Freud's tension reduction wants to do exactly that, reduce is lower the intensity of the excitation present in the body or the psyche, whatever it is. For Nietzsche, will to power is seeking the accumulation and expenditure, but the expenditure itself has this huge accumulative force for the psyche, such that, when I don't know, to use a very kind of basic example, if I get a high pass on my defense on Wednesday, that's a huge discharge and relief, right? But at the same time, it is this huge increase in my how could you say it, circumstantial power for Nietzsche. And this is key because even expenditure, or you might say reduction, but that's the bad word for Freud.
Right.
But even in expenditure, there is accumulation and rising in intensity. That, in fact, is the point of expenditure. That's the aim. It's not for expenditure in itself, it's for the accumulation and re-expenditure, or you could think of it as expression of power. And that's another way you could think of it too. It's the accumulation and expression of power. And of course, that doesn't always work, right? You have to think of, and this is where Nietzsche didn't really develop will to power. You have to think of will to power as having gradations of this expression and kind of twists and turns that do, in fact, want to take it backward. And this is where the reading needs to get subtle between the expenditure of energy and the reduction of tension. But again, in essence, will to power for Nietzsche is this accumulation and expenditure of energy or power, mocked force.
So yeah, my understanding of this as well is that there's this, if I'm understanding right, in all living organisms, I guess you could say, right, and or all of life itself, so all of the cosmos, right. So you take macro to micro, you know, galaxies, the universe itself, um, planets, planetary systems, our planet, so on and so forth. And you get all the way down. It is the will aspect of it is not will like we would think of, the actual will that we have to do things, but more sort of like a force of that's in and around and behind everything, kind of behind the scenes pushing. I guess if you use a Freudian term, unconsciously, but Nietzsche probably wouldn't use it that way. But there's this in everything. There's this force, um, or this type of almost like this energy that needs to be excised out. That is moving and is going and is pushing. And but it seems, I don't. Maybe I'm putting too much in here, but it seems as if it has a goal or it has a purpose, unbeknownst to the conscious self, right? But that there is this, that it has to be this expenditure out, that we have to have that energy or that force produced outward, and that it has to almost be released, if you will. and it for the goal of not expenditure in itself, but the goal of to obtain more power. Is that some way of saying, or am I misunderstanding?
No, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think a good way to illustrate it, or you could say maybe to emphasize this for Nietzsche, is that, and I think I mentioned this in the summary. When you look at death, right? Nietzsche says a bunch of things about life. He says life is just a special kind of death. That's one
Hmm.
funny thing he says.
Right, right.
Um, and he says another thing, that life always lives at the expense of other life, right?
Mm, mm,
It's it's always this it's always this exploitation,
hmm.
and that's such a dirty word.
Sure.
And I guess to rephrase it in a Nietzschean way, that's such a Christian. Um, uh, well, wait, that's a Christian trigger that
Right,
is
right.
residue all over our modern scientific moral sense. But
Mhm.
for Nietzsche, he's trying to be realistic here. He's not trying to be. This isn't some German harsh ideal. This is in terms of a comparison to something closest to it.
Mhm.
And I think I mentioned this in the last podcast. He's following Heraclitus,
Mhm. Mhm.
who said that everything is war.
Right, right.
And we unpack that, and but it's at the same time far more loving and perhaps benign than you would think, and far harsher and ruthless than you might think. It's both of those things, encompassing, of course, or Nietzsche is trying to encompass, and so it makes sense that it encompasses his range. He's trying to encompass everything,
Mhm.
all life,
Yeah.
and not just it's not just and this is the fascinating thing with him. It's not just trying to encompass all life, but all of the cosmos. So all of the interactions, not just of the animate, but also the inanimate.
Mhm.
In this sense, it's a cosmology. So will to power, first and foremost, is a cosmological principle for Nietzsche.
Mm.
It's the only, it's the cosmological principle. Everything else is derivative. Absolutely everything else. So life is a special kind, a rare kind of will to power. And when he says that life is a special kind of death, I think he's really trying to play with and point to the fact that there is essentially, especially when you consider everything as will to power, no distinction between life and death fundamentally.
Right.
Right? You still have these combating wills. So, but to touch back on death as an illustration of this, in death, so life is this amalgamation of wills. Nietzsche says all over the place, the will to this, the will to that, seemingly innumerable wills cohabiting, and by that very token, arranging themselves in a structure, hierarchy, an order. Um, and as this body, this life form, decomposes, degenerates, what's going on essentially, since everything is still will to power, pressing forward, is that the bonds, and you might say the structure itself, of this living body of amalgamated wills, these individual wills to power cohabiting, all their links begin to dissolve. They begin to break off. They begin to get disorganized. And you know, like a den of lions, hungry, they begin to attack one another. And so what you're seeing even in death is this decomposition of will to power, um, or sorry, this decomposition of the connections of will to power,
Mhm.
the cooperation of will to powers within the body that dissolve
Mhm.
and begin to war against themselves. Um, if putting this another way, you consider will to power as um, the good heiress,
Mhm.
then you could see that there is the good heiress this middle region, say, of the bad eris and this evil eris at the bottom in a degenerative scale of will to power. That is to say, this urge to competition, um, this urge to surpassing takes these different forms in a gradation. And finally, at the bottom, the evil eris, which I think really corresponds really well to his critiques of Christianity.
Mm.
The evil eris is this self-destructive. It's death. It's how the body dies. It gets into this form where the will to power, the will to powers within it are directed against themselves. And in that sense, we die. But also in that sense, we were never really alive. We were a particular rare kind of inanimate material that becomes animate somehow. Right? It's so, and that actually is his lowest estimation of life that you'll find, and you only find that in notes. But
Yeah.
anyway,
that there's this inexplicable link between death and dying with life, right? That's all will to power, right? But and I think you had written it that he talks about death as this kind of winding down. It's
mm-hmm.
still will to power. There's still this, like, the process and act of dying, right, is a expenditure, right? Like that's what's happening, right? It's slowing down or it's winding down, but that process of doing it is still will to power, and that
Yeah,
they are linked together. To to die is also to live, and to live is also eventual dying of sorts.
yeah, you could say that. There's a careful transition in lenses here. So how do you say it? In terms of will to power itself, it's kind of incorrect to say that in the dying body, it's expending.
Mm.
Right. That is to say, if you're looking at will to power itself, represented in these multiple forms inside of this living body,
Mm-hmm.
United together, will to power isn't any more expending or accumulating in this process. What's happening is the human or the body or the living thing that which we call the living thing, that
Mm-hmm.
totality is becoming less vital, right?
Yeah.
And so that this gets into kind of the other side of this, right? Nietzsche judges life, and he in fact does this
Mm-hmm.
life and that life against that life and so on, by this very notion of vitality. And what does he mean here? I think what he's talking about, what he's pointing to over and over, is this arrangement of constituent wills within a person, a psyche, a body, even a structure, right? This works for institutions and
Mm-hmm.
religions and all sorts of things. So vitality, a loss of vitality is what occurs in death.
Mm.
Um,
The whole totality of it, right? The whole gestalt
yes.
of a person's will to power, right? There are many
Well,
wills.
the person,
Yeah.
the person is that totality.
Right. So,
Yeah.
but encapsulated within that, we have these very micro wills, right? I have the will to, do this or not do this, or the will to go here or not go here. That's something different. The whole person is the totality of this force, this will to power, this pushing, this moving, this expenditure. That is the total person is that will to power, and then encompassed within that, you can have more specific aspects of what we kind of colloquially know as the will, in our interactions when we say that, in a kind of casual way.
Yeah. Although I think, we have to be careful with the will, like you said earlier, as we take it,
Right.
and kind of putting it another way, the will as we experience it.
Hmm.
And what Nietzsche is talking about when he says will to power, because will to power it's behind the movement of mitochondria. It is mitochondria. It's far more, you might say, or in a purer way than my will to truth is.
Mm.
Although that still is will to power. It's just a convoluted sort mixed with consciousness and society and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But underneath all of that, and this is where Nietzsche's really talking about vitality. Underneath all of that is will to power, and above that, kind of looking at the totality, there's a structure, a superstructure in which these are all arranged. So when Nietzsche says, I'm gonna mix two thoughts here of Nietzsche. When Nietzsche says all philosophy hitherto is an unconscious autobiography, and then he goes and he judges, not just saying, hey, you thought you were doing philosophy, but turns out you're just talking about yourself. Right. But he then goes and judges that philosophy. Right? He doesn't care if you're just talking about yourself ultimately. Right. What he cares about is if that which is coming out of you, he deems vital. He deems powerful, strong. Right? Heraclitus wrote an unconscious autobiography as much as Plato or anyone else in Nietzsche's eyes. However, the big distinction is Heraclitus's cosmology and the way that he aesthetically justifies everything in the universe through the most vile aspect of it, as we would normally say, suffering or competition. But that type of philosophy, Nietzsche wants to say, and always does say, arrives out of this huge vitality, this arrangement of inner will to power that is just potent. It's strong. And that, again, is always circumstantial. It's always relative, you could say. So a Heraclitus perhaps might not be very strong in a different setting. But there are universals, despite Nietzsche's aversion to them in here, such that he can kind of say, Heraclitus is great, so-and-so's great, so-and-so's great. And you notice, he's doing something consistent with these evaluations. But all that to say, life is this arrangement of will to power, arrangement of wills to power in a superstructure, a hierarchy. And to the extent that that hierarchy is solid, its bonds are tight, they're fused, they're secure, and also arranged in a particularly powerful manner, right? If you have safety first as your mantra of moving through the world, you're not going to be a very vital, potent person. So,
well, because your risk budget's going to be too high. You're just going to have an aversion to everything, right? And so you're able to make moves, essentially. I guess my question about this is why is for Nietzsche and how you understand it, why is it will to something, for one, and then why is it will to power, right? And how is he defining that and how you understand it?
Yeah. Well, Nietzsche would say that will in the sense that he's talking about it.
Yes.
It always has an object. Lacan says that the basic essence of the experience of life, I guess you'd say, is desire. He's not the first to say that.
Right.
And Nietzsche's really saying the same thing, but about the cosmos and everything in it. And we could talk about where he started in this formulation, whether in man or in cosmos or what. But irrespective of that, his view is that the essence of the universe is desire, you might say. It's this reaching forward. Now, why pick that as opposed to, say, a passive model? And this, I think Nietzsche would say, first, he'd say, well, I looked into the heart of life itself.
Right, yeah.
In Zarathustra. And there I saw the will to command and the will to obey, and that which cannot command obeys, and so on. And that behavior is something that Nietzsche says he looked everywhere and saw everywhere as the essence of life. It's this movement subtending every other movement. And it's also fair to say too that I think Nietzsche set out to do this kind of philosophy. He likes this kind of philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
Cosmologies
Yeah.
for Nietzsche, for a philosophy of will to power, a cosmology is the biggest power grab. You know, it's you're taking the entire universe
Right. Right.
and putting it in this
It's grand.
book
Yeah,
or
it's
this
grand.
bag. You know, yeah. So
So, but how does he understand
why?
power, right? Why? Because you had mentioned just kind of offhand, like, will, you could have will to truth or will to, whatever. But he's saying will to power, and I hear you on the command and the obey piece, right? But he has. It seems to me that he has a certain understanding or idea of what power is, and maybe what it is not, or maybe there are different dimensions about power. How do you think he understands that?
Yeah. Well, he understands it in the most basic sense as mastery, or you might say
Competence,
dominion.
strength, competence.
Well, competent, no, I don't mean in terms of a skill. It's
Okay.
always in relation to another,
Hmm.
right? Always,
Hmm.
right? This is even you could do self as relation, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
but especially if you strip this down or you back up all the way to the cosmic scale, what you're going to see is not human relation. You're going to see just nonstop undulating relations of power dynamics.
Yes.
So, and what he means by that is quite simply, and it's best seen all the way reduced to its simplest form, and that is just in force. Right?
Hmm.
Think of it in bodies.
Hmm.
What Nietzsche's doing is Nietzsche's personifying, you might say, the Newtonian body.
Hmm.
Right? He says his understanding of the eternal return is, like I said, Plato and materialist, mechanistic view merged together. Well, in Will to Power, he's doing something kind of similar, where he's saying everything is will to power, and everything, therefore, but that's an explanation of the totality. Then he says, okay, what I mean by that is if you get close, what you see is the same exact thing happening everywhere. So that's why he calls it one thing.
Hmm.
But you see the same thing happening everywhere. And what it is this Heraclitean opposition, intention.
Mm-hmm.
It's, there are a lot of philosophers of the last 30, 40 years who try to go, they go to great lengths to try to say Nietzsche doesn't mean this opposition. That's the opposite of what he means, and so on. But that's exactly what he means. He means that at every point in time, there are forces in struggle with other forces. And so, why is it power and not something else? Well, because he's saying with this formulation that power is at the bottom of everything else. You can say something else, but it's just a derivative of power.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is he saying that? Again, it's because of his observations of what he thinks is essential in life.
Mm-hmm.
And then he pushes that to the chemical realm and thereby to the inanimate realm. But yeah, it's very German, right? That's one reading, we could say.
Sure, yeah. Sure,
It's
yeah.
very German. But so is Freud.
Sure,
And
yeah.
he's the opposite, and so is Schopenhauer. Nietzsche might say it's not, how do I say it? It wasn't representative of the German of his time.
Yeah,
Germany of his time, because that was, degenerate, not even a people.
Right.
But with this, and this is something I think is always really important to keep in mind. He's modeling it after Heraclitus. And I don't mean that he found Heraclitus and said, oh, I want to copy this.
Right.
I've written a bit on this, and Heraclitus and Nietzsche are really similar people.
Mm-hmm.
Their dispositions are very similar. They're very active, aggressive personalities.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that they punch you in the face on the street.
Sure.
But they're thinkers. And as thinkers, they're incredibly aggressive. And, so if we were to pull a Freud on Nietzsche and try to psychologize this, and that's really where you have to go when you get to why strength.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go to outside of the arguments, because for Nietzsche, this is a it's an assumption. It's a choice. You know, we can just as justifiably make a cosmology based on suffering.
Mm-hmm.
We can just as easily and just as correctly make one like Freud based on reduction.
Right.
And Nietzsche's main critique, I think, a subtle one, but it's crucial, um, is that all of those options really do lie before us.
Mm.
They all are really options. At one point or another, they all were useful in some way, or could be. And if we were to come up with one in the future, it would be derived out of our need or the particular person's need and disposition, and so for Nietzsche, he would say, well, why power? Because I'm healthy as hell. I am vitality.
Yeah.
So yeah, and stepping back again into that quote about all philosophy hitherto is an unintentional autobiography. Nietzsche's is an intentional. He's not saying I don't do autobiography, I do real philosophy.
Right.
That's where people don't. That's a key misconception of Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
He's not claiming to do real philosophy. He's not trying to be objective here.
Right. Well, he writes about that too. I mean, if people that read his writing, they know that he's always talking about it in a kind of in a meta way, but he's doing it. He's not writing about it. And his life tried to be that. I mean, when you see how kind of nomadic he was in some ways, and most of his life I think was outside of Germany. So he was very much about doing it. I would agree with that.
Yeah, and this makes me think of other places where he says things like, I love only those who write in blood. And he wants, and he always holds people to the standard and also the kind of explanation of living up to quote unquote their philosophy, or being their philosophy being a product of their life, really. And
yeah. So let me ask something. We're going to come to Freud. I haven't forgot about Freud. I'm going to come to him in a minute, but I think while we're here, it probably makes sense to do this. Two other questions. So I just want to ask, and I think I got this right, and sort of clarify. I don't think the will to power, and I don't think how Nietzsche is describing both the will to power and then why towards power itself. I don't necessarily think, at least at one juncture, he's making a value statement about it. It seems maybe in other places eventually he does, but I think at a first pass, he's making an observational analysis of life at its bare bones, right? All at bottom in life and doing life. This is what is. This is sort of how I read it. Maybe afterwards he would make a value judgment, but I think at least in a first pass, he's saying this is what this is. And so he's not saying necessarily you should or you shouldn't. I mean, obviously I think he's biased towards people wanting to have that, but I think he's recognizing that, again, it's not like a coat you put on, like you wear it or you don't wear it. It is like it exists. And then I think there's maybe certain dimensions to it. How do you see it that way?
I agree. I agree with that. However, I would disagree with the hesitancy on the prescriptive aspect.
Okay, tell us about it. What do we do with the will to power, or how does each individual use the will to power? How do you see it based on Nietzsche?
Yeah, well, we could stick just with Zarathustra for a minute.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think that's really helpful for people trying to think about these. So I said earlier that in Zarathustra says, I looked into the heart of life, and what did I see? What does he say is the essence? He's commanding and obeying.
Yeah.
It's just master and slave is what he does in the genealogy. Now, he then goes to will to power, right? Will to power is in the slave as well. It's in the subservient one who wants to rule over a still yet weaker one, he says. So keep that in mind, right? This is the essence of life. Now let's look at some of the kind of phraseology of Nietzsche. Nietzsche says in the prologue of Zarathustra, remain true to the earth, the Superman that is surpassing that being which has surpassed man, from within man to that which is beyond man, right? That which and how does he say this process occurs, right? We could go into the metamorphoses. What is the child doing? This height of the three metamorphoses. The child is great. He says, why do we need the child still? Why does the spirit still need the child?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the spirit needs the child for innocence and creating and commanding,
Mm-hmm.
right? And later on, he says, tear down all of these formulations, these ancient degenerate structures of good and evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tear down the tablets, right? The commands,
Mm-hmm.
the old tablets and commands, right? The Mosaic Law, etc., Vedanta, all of it. He says, tear it all down, right? And he says, it's okay. I took away all your speckled shells. There's no more values, but go forward and command, you commanding ones.
Mm-hmm.
Create, command, right? This philosophy, this living with a hammer, which, by the way, is not just for destruction. It's for destruction, and then it's for chiseling a sculpture out of a boulder, as Nietzsche says. Right? Humanity sits as this rock that's just unhewn, and he wants to form something out of it. That's will to power as well. And I don't mean, and this is what's important, slavery, the slave mentality, slave morality is all will to power too,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in this sense, you're right. It's just descriptive. He doesn't care. But it's absolutely crucial to understand that there are gradations or different types of will to power.
Yeah, dimensions. I like to think of it that way.
But dimensions isn't the right way to think about it because it's a value. It's valuative.
Yeah. Okay. That's
Degeneration is not a good word for Nietzsche. Period. He hates it. He says it many times. In fact, he says, "What do we hate worst of all? Degeneration."
Because
degeneration.
Is there an active way of not creating, or there's an active way of not doing life? Is that kind of the reason why he has a kind of an allergy to that?
No, I mean, degeneration is weakness. I mean, to be blunt about it, in his prescriptive formulations, Nietzsche considers weakness as sin to be Christian, right? Where you said God formerly, the great consoler, the forgiver, the kind of idol of the last man. He says, where you used to say, God, I teach you to say Superman, the embodiment of surpassing. So what you see in the last man and the Superman for Nietzsche is they're polar opposites. They sit at the apex of two ends of one scale. It's all will to power, right? And so, sure, it's all neutral, but it's not, because this is a scale. And the last man is horrible. The last man is an expression of will to power that is degenerate. It's all bent up. It's the evil eras. It's degenerating. That is, it prefers what injures. And so, even right there, you see prescription. You see Nietzsche's you see his own table of values. Nietzsche talks about injury. Being degenerate is preferring what injures. Right there, he's saying good and bad.
Yeah,
he's saying there's an injury and there's an increase in vitality. And so to be at the height of this will to power is to prefer what strengthens. And so those are the two poles, right? And everything else is somewhere in between. So it's absolutely essential to see that, yes, his cosmology is a value structure. So when Nietzsche says will to power, and then when he says will to truth, or will to knowledge, or will to self-preservation, or something like that, right? When he says these things, will to power is set aside from those. The latter are those, but they're convoluted derivations of them.
Yeah.
You see how they're modified they're modifications in a Spinozian sort of way. Whereas will to power is this pure. It's this pure essence. So when you're acting closest to the meaning of the earth, you are acting in sync with the cosmos, and your vitality levels are high. You're instinctual, right? Nietzsche says that to act uninstinctually is the only way to act immorally in his eyes.
Yeah.
Right. So, and what does he mean by that? He means, well, when I don't act instinctually and I consider this and that through all my conscious sociological, economical lenses, I'm not thinking instinctually. Like, sure, there's instinct at the bottom of it or whatever, but Nietzsche says there's a type of living which he picked certain people as ideals. As he says, Napoleon is half Superman.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely a value judgment.
Sure. So on the prescriptive side of this, it does seem that, you tell me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't know if he would make the stretch to make an absolute statement and say, well, everyone should want this, but he's definitely placing or because there's a difference between should everybody want this or should everybody strive for this and can they strive for this? Those are two different constructs, I guess. But ideally, to live life as a human being is to understand your will to power, to access it, and to seek strength and command. Like to not be passive, to not be idle, to not suspend your or put on the shelf your power, that you seek that you want that you're trying to find within that hierarchical structure your will to power that you is helping you to be more and more and more active towards the overman, right? To be towards, like, that's what you should do as an individual. Is that somewhere along the lines of where he would potentially say that?
Yeah, although here to point in the other direction, that is a descriptive lens. He's the Christian or the neurotic or the absolute degenerate. They want what you just said they should want. For Nietzsche, they want that too. They're striving for power as much as he is. And perhaps more so, to strive, to have this this extended. I'm trying. That's evidence right there for Nietzsche that you're just not a vital organization, order. And so, what I want to say there is, though, that will to power, the striving after power, is what everybody and everything does. Period.
Yeah.
There's no telling you to do it where you're not really doing it. The last man is striving for power too. But where Nietzsche's taking issue is the way you strive for power. It's all about the way, right? So when he's criticizing the ascetic priest, when he's criticizing Paul the apostle, he's not saying, well, you guys are just a bunch of pansies who don't go after power. He's saying you guys go after power in the most underhanded, disingenuous, snake-like, lying, stealing, backhand, you do it behind 1,000 masks and tell people you're this and that. It's not like he's against lying and deception per se.
Yeah.
But that which is strong does not need to dissemble. And furthermore, he would say there are ways to gather strength at the detriment of your entire species, right? The Superman isn't just, it's really not primarily an individual formulation, like, hey, you should be the super you.
Yeah.
What it really is essentially, in its most vital form, is that which surpasses man. He says, what have you done to surpass man? And what have you done to surpass yourself is an echo of that. It comes after. And so when someone is doing this what he would consider very degenerating backdoor grabs. The reason why those are bad is because they make everything else degenerate.
I can see that.
So, um, when something is self-destructive, this isn't just something he sees in institutions. He sees it in a tree. When something is self-destructive and rotting, right? He's always talking about those who live too long, right? They stayed on the vine and rotted for too long and ruined any fruit they have, and you know maybe they'll go into a barrel and also ruin all of the other fruit. Um, that's kind of how he sees these expressions of will to power that are less than, inferior.
Hmm.
That's exactly what they are.
Hmm.
When you're at a certain level of inferior, the only avenue you have is backdoor
Mm.
ways to power.
Mm.
You could think of it in another way. What is it? The IEDs, or the IED is the people's revolt or something. I'm messing that up, but
Hmm.
what I'm trying to say is there's this expression that's negative, that's detrimental, not just to the person doing it, but also to the whole.
Mm.
Um, and that too is will to power, but it's a
Right.
bad kind. It's a terrible kind. So Nietzsche's, philosophy with a hammer, smashing everything, and these glorious displays of power. Um, that is what he's trying to say is a model. Not that everybody should do it, or like you said, that everybody could. His
Yeah.
point is very few could, very
Yes.
few can,
Yes.
and he
Yes.
doesn't know if anyone else can. He says we might be running out of time.
Right.
We can't even do this anymore. We're so not vital.
Hmm.
That's the danger. And with nihilism, he says this will to power, would rather will nothing
Mm.
than not will at all.
But
That's you know,
in that way, so there's the way in which, like, yes, this, this degenerate way of saying, like, this striving is, that's one way of will to power, but not the model he's thinking of. So what would be the, I don't want to say positive inverse of that, but what would be the very positive way in which this looks like this kind of, hammer, this, going about the world or philosophizing with a hammer?
Nietzsche, philosopher, and this pops up a lot of times in philosophy. Philosopher is the pinnacle in terms of expressions of will to power.
Mm.
Like I was saying, Nietzsche says to to see the cosmos as eternal return, that is, as a cycle,
Mm-hmm.
is the closest approximation of the world of becoming to a world of being. And as we were saying a minute ago, right? When you read a cosmology, you just put the universe in your pocket,
Right. Right. Right.
um, right? And that's a lot to unpack, but there's a lot of psychological stuff going on there, and Nietzsche would agree, right? It's this, to understand everything is to have control over it
Mm-hmm.
in many respects. Not just, it's not something I'm saying. That's something Nietzsche says, right? That's
Yeah.
what the will to understanding. That's what the will to philosophy is for Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
So when at the end of Zarathustra, no, I guess it's not at the end, but in Zarathustra, when they're standing at the river of becoming, right, and he paints this picture of the people stream, this flow of culture and time and events
Mm-hmm.
going along. Right, for Nietzsche, with his will to power, is putting his boat, he says, dressed up with all these fineries as if it's something really special and fancy and worthy of reverence, and sets it on the stream. And what he's doing there is he's imposing his will to power. And I bring that up, to go back, because there isn't another way you could express a higher will to power for Nietzsche.
Mm.
Alexander the Great, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that's maybe the equivalent, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
It's this very physical equivalent. Whereas for Nietzsche, is conquering the universe from his mountain walks. Um, so obviously Nietzsche doesn't think everyone could do that.
Yeah.
There are very few who could do it. He calls Zarathustra in the subtitle a book for all and none.
Right.
Um, and that really that captures what he's getting at. There are a lot of factors here. He's an elitist. He's
Yeah.
also an elitist when it comes to behavior. He thinks most is trash and some is great. And that maps perfectly onto this scale of degeneration or vitality, or that, that is the scale of will to power, this cosmic universal. Um, so he does talk about ideals, right? He talks about Caesar, Mozart, uh, Cesare Borgia,
Hmm.
uh, and I'm not saying that they're ideals necessarily.
Hmm.
Nietzsche is still awaiting the Übermensch and has not
Right.
yet seen him.
Right.
But guys like Heraclitus, those other people I mentioned, and they stand out. He would consider himself in that list as well.
Hmm.
But that's not to say that he would consider every philosopher in that list,
Sure.
because many philosophers say Kant is, there's a lot of charlatanism, he would
Hmm.
say, tartuffery
Hmm.
going on with Kant. Whereas for him, he's standing there open, bare chested. He's not he's not afraid, and he values that type of stance. Uh,
It almost seems, in terms of the active piece of it, that there's a sort of there's a sort of kind of demeanor or attitude, but I'm going back to the child and thinking about this kind of purity, right? It's like when you're a child, you're an infant or a toddler, there's a sort of, I mean, we're all narcissists at that point or whatever, but it's this kind of way of like very open to the world and curious, and then just doing it and unlocking that. And then as we grow throughout the world, and we have experiences and we have all these things, it becomes, secluded or pushed down, or we have all these other things. But it seems like as if there's a sort of piece of that where it's in terms of maybe it's one of those things, not you have it or you don't, but in this way of how do you have a spirit of that or an attitude of that where you're saying, hey, how can I be open and as authentic as possible, and to, I guess you could say, attack life in some ways. Um, that you don't know that unless you are able to do that, or if you can figure that out, right? I don't know, you don't know, and then you have those things. If you think about those, those folks that you mentioned, they had a not necessarily a mission, right? But it was this kind of, I guess, a sort of kind of an attitude or demeanor of how they approached life and how they did life, and they went with that. That's just kind of the pattern I'm recognizing there. How do you think about that?
yeah, I mean, uh, are you saying they weren't inhibited? Perhaps is that
Yeah,
what you're
yeah,
saying?
yeah. That there is this openness. There's this. I guess the word you could use is this courageous mentality. This kind of, um, not as risk adverse in some ways. It was, you kind of take life by the horns kind of thing. I'm kind of, you know being very simplistic here, but that there is a kind of way of, less fears, less anxieties, and more, um, just active. I don't know how to say it another way, but just kind of very participatory way of being in life.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah, I think so. Nietzsche's asked, well, yeah, he's asked a couple times, or I think once in Zarathustra, what were your reasons for doing this or that? And he says, reasons. What have I to do with reasons? I can barely remember why I should do something, in the moment, let alone remember why I did it, and something along those lines. It gets very confusing, and people do weird things with that. But there's this notion of his relating to what you're talking about, tied into history, one's philosophy of history, um, and that is, when it comes to how you live, he imagines the animal the dog, the cow, and they live in this kind of ever-present now. Um, why would you dwell on the past? Why would you think about the past? Well, it's usually this willing backward. There's not a whole lot of activity going on when you're trying to conjure up memories and such. However, it's this, like you said, it's this stance where there is a goal and it is attained. Another way you could think of it is that the nobles, these original creators of good and bad, these noble aristocratic men, people, when they were angered by someone or something, they would vent their anger on it right then and there. Why? Because they didn't need to wait. The only reason why anyone waits to vent their anger or do whatever they want to do is because of limitation. That is weakness, right? We only develop justice, Nietzsche argues, because we are too afraid to act on our own impulses. Therefore, we put a stopgap in so that we don't have to. It's wrong to, in fact, based on our laws, right? So Nietzsche says that's out of fear, not of the other mainly. Fear of the other, fear of punishment, fear of the consequence, or fear of your own inability to do X, Y, and Z. But a very important point, and something that makes Nietzsche almost not useful, I would say, in therapy, unless you kind of detach one piece or something of him, is that, and this gets back to the prescription description aspect. Nietzsche definitely only thinks a select few can ever or will ever attain this. And insofar as he's trying to help them, and he's definitely trying to do that in his writing, right? He's trying to express himself, but he's looking for his children, he always says. Right. And insofar as he's trying to help them, he recognizes that these people are already suited for this. Right? It's not that they just have it in them and they haven't gotten it out yet. It's that they are the type of person who can do this, who does this. And everyone else is not, and that's the way it should be, right? He says the herd, the little man, the last man is necessary. All right, and this is a particularly harsh quote. He says, many a one casts away his final worth when he casts away his servitude. And this is a critique, this lines up with his critique of democracy, of equality, of freedom. He says, freedom, you all roar, but freedom for what? All you say is freedom from, right? Pointing to the fact that most people can barely manage their day or are swallowed up in all kinds of things, such that there's very little vitality, there's very little creativity, there's no possibility for the strength that it takes to tear down the whole, structure of philosophy and attempt to rebuild it. That's really what he's trying to talk about. So you want to see this quintessential expression of will to power. Look at his philosophy with a hammer and the creative aspect that kind of subtly lies in. That nothing could really compare to that. So and it's just very uninhibited. He's so harsh. He's and a lot of this goes back to as well his style of writing too. It's just uninhibited, almost free flowing thought. It's invective. So anyway, that's a long answer to that.
No.
This is a very difficult. It's very difficult, and Nietzsche did not spell this stuff out.
I think that's
he stopped too soon.
This main point that we've been talking about is, he got sick and he died and he couldn't really flush it out as well as I think he probably could have, which is so frustrating. So it's always incomplete. But I don't know if you tell me. I want to talk about the instincts, because if the will to power is this force that has a organismic impulse, I see a lot of the instincts that are in there, but maybe we talk about the instincts first, and then I can ask about Darwinianism, because I know the Darwinian model is very strong, but it does not necessarily. I don't think it's incompatible with Freud's thinking. It might be, but it definitely is not. They're not saying the same thing. I get so. Maybe you want to tell us about instincts, and we'll talk about a little bit of Darwinian kind of principles.
Yeah. Instincts between Nietzsche and Freud, that's a huge point of divergence, as is to be expected, given their different formulations of life. I didn't really explain Freud's formulation of life in detail, but
Do you want to do that
um,
first, or you want?
well, yeah. I think I might be able to do it while we do instincts.
Okay, let's do that
Um,
then. Because Freud
well, I
is very passive, right? He's this retrospective, with the death instinct and everything, which is later Freud, second half of Freud, after reading and hearing all his criticisms, because it was all sex forever, and then he started talking about the death instinct. So I don't know, maybe you want to set it up then in that way.
yeah. Well, for Freud's conception of life, and this is the main divergence for the Nietzsche Freud um, comparison. Uh, Freud's conception of life is based on this image he has of this protozoa, this very basic life form, and what is making it a life form? What's making it not inanimate matter? Because Freud says it emerged from inanimate matter. What's making it that is that this body somehow had a means to register this first life form, somehow had a means to register excitation,
Hmm.
that is an increase in tension. And then life happened as it set about trying to reduce that. That for Freud is the essence and the beginning of life, the kernel of life. That activity right there rests at the bottom of every other process or activity of the body or the psyche or organic life in general.
And it's this unconscious way of trying to say we are, whether we don't understand, or well, I said, we don't know this, in moment to moment, but we're trying to always, with our, this does lead into instincts or impulses. We're trying to reduce this tension. Like, we have it, and we have to reduce it. um
Yeah, that's the essence of life itself for Freud,
mhm.
which is why, and this gets a little bit tricky when you combine it with the life instincts, and we'll do that in a minute. But
Mhm.
um, at its essence, life is that body. The life form is that body which is striving to reduce the excitation within it. Um, and so it has all of these processes set up, some of which even lead to minor excitations within the body. But it has this entire process set up of cycles that return back. You could think of it as this thing going down the road that constantly peels off itself and goes back and joins back with an earlier portion of itself,
Mhm.
such that it never really goes anywhere, or it only goes somewhere reluctantly and slowly.
Mhm.
And I'm talking in terms of development.
It's a
So
loop. It's almost like a loop, where you just, in different ways, you keep coming back to the same kind of road. You keep going over and over and over.
yeah, exactly. Life for Freud, as he puts it, um, seeks to return on the developmental track to an earlier condition. It seeks to reinstate an earlier condition. So, and we have to again separate here between life and then life drives or eros,
Yep.
and then also someone's life. Those are three different ways, but life in terms of a life form or life as opposed to death for Freud. I'm looking at an illustration I drew of it, and how it works is you imagine life in the center, this circle, this life form that I just said emerged from the registration of tension and the processes that seek to reduce that. So this is life. And for Freud, you have, and this is getting into the drives and the instincts, you have the death drive you could say, going off to the left backward to death. It's going to the inanimate, right? So remember, we have this first little nucleus of life. It has a very short way to go to become just a mass of lifelessness again. But there's this other drive in it, the life drive, the eros. This is sexual drive to sexual reproduction, and etc. That also, right, as life goes along its path, that life's path leads to death. And the life drive, right, these reproductive drives. So you've got life in the middle, one drive going backward toward the inanimate, one drive going forward, and it's going to culminate in death. Freud says that since life results in death, death is its goal. And then off of this center thing, you have, like you said, this looping back cycle. That's what reproduction is for Freud, right? Reproduction is this harkening backward. There's this another way I was trying to envision, or using a thought experiment to explain it. Imagine a 20-foot tall person on the highway. Okay, this is kind of silly, but I think it works. There are cars coming at this person. He's opposing traffic. There are cars coming at this person. And development is the direction that the cars are going, right? You could think of these cars as environmental pressure. Freud says that the life form develops due to external pressures, and it resists development. It does not want to develop. It wants to go back to reinstate a former condition. So imagine this giant person standing on the highway, and it can't touch the road for some reason, and it wants to stay at this particular mile marker. It does not want to move. I think of this road as the process of development. Well, life for Freud is this giant hopping from car to car, each instance a different manifestation of life, and it's striving with all of its power, even though it's making new life forms, to stay at this spot. It does not want to develop. Development for Freud is something forced upon the life form. It resists it with everything because it wants to stay, not just where it is, it wants to get back as early as possible. So there's this teleology here in development for Freud, where life doesn't just want to occupy the last form. It wants to go back as early as possible. It ideally wants to go back to the inanimate.
Yes.
So,
can I put that another way? So
ahead.
My understanding of that is that's great. I think it's this idea of, we have, before we're alive, we are inanimate objects, right? Before in the womb and all these things, and we come out, and he sees dying and that instinct for dying as a return to this primordial form of us, and that pool from it is always there, and that we are being pulled, if you will. This kind of instinct, right? This drive is getting back to the former aspect of ourselves, right? It's this in when we weren't fully completely animated as a life form. And he juxtaposed this with, I think, the libidinal drives as well, right? And how they function, they play a role, while we're in life. I think what you said is true about development as well, is that there's this kind of, in development, and we will be in kind of ensconced in one of these stages of development, and we don't want to go to the next stage, but we are again pulled by this drive that is pushing us into the next developmental stage. Does that sound about right in your reading of it?
Yeah, we're forced to develop. He says, by the position of our sun in the revolution of our Earth. Getting to Darwin. Yeah, he says that this development is this. It's a violation, of life. Life just wants to stay. It wants to go back, and at the best, stay. And I think what you said is right. Another way you might imagine this because it is difficult to imagine, but it's really important to get the essence of his theory. Another way to imagine it is, for all those people who like to play video games and beat the different levels and all that, imagine playing a game in reverse, saving a game in reverse, right? We normally start and then we get to level 2 and we're like, saved it, sweet, because I'm gonna die a bunch. That's the image of Darwinian evolution, you might say. Playing a game forward. For Freud, the game is played backward. And people are like, shit, we beat the game. I'm really developed here and very powerful and very complex. I've got all of these processes and internal excitations and all this bother, right? That's really the issue with Freud, is this is all just a bother to the life form. And and so the life form wants to be like, well, I'd like to get back to the level before the end level, and then to the level before that level. And that's what it wants. If you were to, and he does ascribe this personified teleology to life itself, whereas pointing in the direct opposite direction, literally, life for Nietzsche is inanimate, and then a special form of the inanimate, organic life, which he says all life hitherto has created something beyond itself. What have you done to surpass man? Right? And you get this description, this kind of picture of life, which, as we said, in our evaluations, that discussion about his evaluation of different wills to power, the ideal, right? Nietzsche doesn't just have one version of the trajectory of life. Freud does. Nietzsche's has two possibilities and every combination between, where there's this straight shot, the kind of picture you get in the statement that I just said, that every life, or all life, has created something beyond itself. It's this active pressing forward, development, surpassing is that which is desired by life for Nietzsche. The inversion of what Freud is saying. And so ideally, life is going to move from this form, surpass, and develop. Man will not, in this case, in this ideal case, man will not become the letzter Mensch, will not become the last man. Man will become the Superman, that which is beyond man. And as he says, man will seem as ape seems to man now, a laughingstock, a thing of shame. But there's this other trajectory that he's always complaining about, that he's philosophizing against, and that is this degenerate trajectory, which you could imagine kind of drops down off of that straight line and does what Freud's does. That particular degenerate line wants to stay. It does not want to develop. That's the issue with the last man. It does not want to develop. It doesn't want to become better. Derrida and Deleuze get all confused here and think that difference is what matters. That the last man doesn't want to become different. And that's what Nietzsche's on about, which is ridiculous. But anyway, those are the kind of pictorial images, if what I was saying was somewhat clear, of the two conceptions of life and kind of the direction. And to your question about Freud and Darwin, I think you're right. They are somewhat compatible. And
you mean Darwin and Nietzsche?
No, I mean Darwin and Freud.
Oh, you mean Darwin and Freud? Okay.
Yeah, because actually, Nietzsche and Darwin have the same relationship as Freud and Nietzsche do, where they talk about the same things. One does it in this retreating, self-preservative. Self-preservation is so key, really. So for Darwin, Nietzsche's issue with Darwin was that he did the entire thing passively. If you survive, you will develop. It's this this cart before the horse for
If
Nietzsche.
nature selects you, then maybe.
Right. If you beat this statistical game
Hmm.
and you happen upon this thing that makes you
Hmm.
a little bit better just by, just by chance. There's no activity really in this.
Hmm.
And so Nietzsche's not. I'm not saying evolution is chance. What Nietzsche's gripe with it is that it's external
Yeah.
development via externality. Another issue he has with
Sort of though.
Freud.
Sort of though. I mean, genetics tells us a few things about Darwinism, excuse me, internally as well. But that's kind of before Nietzsche and all these guys.
Well, yeah, I mean, we could talk about epigenetics and that sort of thing,
Mhm.
but the big point, I think, and the big divergence between Darwin and Nietzsche is that development for Nietzsche is this active. Everything's active.
Mhm.
There really is no need for Nietzsche,
Mm.
right? And that's kind of the crucial distinction. Everything is desire. Need is only a word used by people who can't get what they want, and
Mhm.
it's pressing.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
whereas for Darwin and for Freud, they're really basing everything off of this hierarchy of needs.
Mm.
This you must have X, Y, and Z, and therefore it makes sense that you did X, Y, and Z, and so the just so stories of an evolutionary psychology would be often completely reversed for Nietzsche.
Mhm.
They're anyway. Um, there's a lot more similarity between Freud and Darwin for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I guess my question is on because the similarity I see is the kind of little bit more passive element, um, juxtaposed with Nietzsche's very active element. But my question on this, staying with Freud for a minute, is, um, maybe explain to us these libidinal or sexual drives and urges, right? I would imagine that how Nietzsche is talking about, like in an active life, everything is desire, everything is pleasurable. That there may be some, and I'm not trying to find the overlap, but just I can't help but think that there is an overlap. And how do you see that as um, different, or do you see that as different in those aspects? Because I mean, that was the big thing for Freud was his whole, sexual drive.
yeah. Well, this is tricky because for Freud, once you really get reading him, his death drive makes sense.
Yes.
It's as my professor says, even though many analysts have rejected the death drive, and Freud even posited it in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, kind of tentatively,
Hmm.
um, but nonetheless, he held it throughout his life, um, well, throughout the end of his life. Yeah, so the life drives. However, I said the death drives are kind of inevitable. Once you see that Freudian life and psyche is based on this principle of tension reduction, then the death drive just kind of unfolds. And that's how it worked for Freud eventually. He saw the necessity of it in repetition compulsion and so on. So the issue with the death drive for Freud was that it brought about, it reanimated, it returned experiences in the repetition compulsion, which is one of the places where he saw it manifested clearly.
Hmm.
But repeated and continually manifested these experiences that caused pain, right?
Mm.
And so
Yeah.
there he develops this pull toward death, this pull toward tension reduction.
Hmm.
And
In other words,
on the
that
other end,
the death instinct is this fact of you want to reduce tension. The ultimate aim is this return to the primordial inanimate, which is the death instinct, right? Or before you're a living organism, and so there, you are pushing towards that in some ways. That there's all of life is a type of tension reduction. The way you don't have that anymore is if you don't exist, if you if you die.
exactly, yeah, that's the
Um,
ultimate. It's
that's
the
the
Nirvana
ultimate,
principle, as it's
right?
called.
Right. And
I
so
think Barbara Lowe, yeah.
right, right. So then the life instinct, where the sexual drive is primary, um, is a type of, mm, almost, if you could say, I don't want to say a stopgap, but it's a way of reducing tension as we're living, right? If we can't get death, right? And again, this is Freud did this before he did the death instinct stuff, but that would be the way to to have. We're doing this recapitulation, and it's through this type of drive. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, and this is really my reading. Not to try to take anything away from it, but you'll find lots of other. Well, you'll find another way of seeing this. But yes, I see both Freudian life and death. So both eros and thanatos, life instincts and death instincts,
Hmm.
uh, going backward.
Mm.
And that's the trend that I'm highlighting as in this thesis. Now, now that doesn't really present a complete picture of the issue that eros or the life drive or libido or the reproductive instincts, right? All of those are really synonymous in Freud's later formulations. That's not to say that those things in their tension raising capacity function don't complicate this whole image of Freud. They do.
Mm.
The image that I'm painting of Freudian life.
Mhm.
And I'll back up and say too that Freud never integrated this life drive well into his theory. Never, it never worked out. And I don't mean it didn't work. Obviously, he did a lot with it, but it never really jived with the whole thing.
Mm.
Like I said, the death drive makes sense. Tension reduction. This life thing doesn't make sense that much, and so in league with all of his directionality in life and tension reduction and psyche as essence, he really painted, and I'm emphasizing this and pushing it a bit. He painted life as this thing that also reaches backward, harkens backward, and so just like you said, it's a stopgap. Really, what life, in terms of eros, is attempting to do is save the game in reverse, like I was saying.
Right, right,
We will go no further. We'd like to go backward,
right, right.
is what Freudian life, qua instinct,
Hmm.
is saying. And so, in that way, reproduction is itself self preservative, you see.
Mm. Yeah, that there's this way of saying, okay, we exist, right? And this drive is going to help us exist until we die. And if we don't have that, um, obviously people can. You're kind of looking at death in a different way, right? There's ways of saying like, well, you might die at 40, you might die at it doesn't mean you have to live a whole life until you're 80, right? People die all the time at different ages, but in a kind of standard, quote unquote, normal development, that's kind of the model. And so it says, okay, well, we have to have a way of it. Basically, the way I see it is that you have this way of living life that is his model of life is this, I don't want to say reactionary, but it's a response to something that's already happening. It's like, well, this happens, so how do we manage, or how do we navigate? Oh, okay. We need to manage and navigate by this life drive that helps us somehow in an incomplete way get through life. And then finally, when the death instinct, which is overlapping, will say, well, we finally go back to the primordial state that was more inanimate, which is I don't want to say a goal, but that's another way of doing it. And so in that way, the life instinct is more of a way of saying, how do we manage through life with these drives that kind of present that kind of way of navigating through it.
Yeah, no, that's right. It is always a reaction, right? Uh, Saying Freudian life and psyche is passive isn't quite right. Saying it's reactive is better. Um, but Freud put it this way: life seeks to die in its own way, and
Unpack that a little bit.
and this really is touching upon reproduction. It's really touching upon eros,
Hmm.
libido, all those things. are really preceding this, but they serve toward the end of reproduction. Right? Eros, he's figuring that as that which governs the impulses toward reproduction and the reproductive cells. And so, in this sense, there's this resistance. You can imagine in life this perpetual intention to stay.
Mm.
And so all of a sudden you find yourself alive and you want to stay. It's this homeostatic equilibrium, this desire for stability. And so, while we could say that there's this death drive that constantly winds down, it wants to decrease. Life, you might say, for Freud, wants to stay. There's also this hearkening backward. But that is, it wants to stay in its prior position. That's what it can do. So, and this is weird. I'm not saying this is reasonable necessarily or that it makes a lot of sense. But what Freud argues is that, like we were saying, the life form resists development. And you could think of death as a development in a way, right? It's changing. It's changing it's not staying what it is. It's changing. So what life is doing for Freud on this kind of meandering, always reaching back circuit is it wants, like you said, to die in its own way. It has this particular way. It says, I would like to die. He's kind of envisioning life as death. I would like to die like the last saved model. Do you see? So it's dying in its own way. That is, and he puts it another way, right? He says that the life instincts, eros, all instincts are conservative.
Yeah.
And so another way you could think of life as a hearkening backward, this reaching backward, is that life seeks to reinstate the condition of tension reduction itself. You see? It doesn't, it's almost like life is after tension reduction as tension reduction. It wants to bring the condition about where that is the case. Whereas the death drive wants to kill this thing. And yeah, it's subtle and difficult.
Yeah, let me see if I can translate in case some of the listeners are a little like, what is this like tautology we got going on? So, okay, so there's the way how I'm understanding what you're saying is that when we're born, so we start out as cells and all these, and even before that, inanimate objects, and then we form, and at that point, once we're born, right, it's kind of like you're getting to a big game or something like that, right? A big game of life, if you will, and you can prepare, let's say, and once you finally get there, you're like, oh, this isn't so bad. I kind of want this to not end. Oh, okay. And so there's this element of life then takes on another, I don't want to say form, that's not right, or not layer, but is that when you finally actually are there, then you don't want to leave life. And that becomes very salient. And so then you have basically these two, warring drives internally of we got to return to death. We got to get there. We got to die. We got to do it in our way. We have to living life is being able to die in our way to return back to the, primordial form. But then it's like, well, no, I'm here now in life and I don't want to do that. Right. And so we have these competing drives throughout our existence, if you will. And in another way, kind of like you were saying with the development, right? If you think about you think about psychosexual stages, right? When you have the oral stage, right? All you want is like pure pleasure, right? It's just all, as seen in the, oral manifestations or oral fixations, right? So it's just this, I want, the mother's breast or I want the bottle, and I get so much pleasure from that. And then everything else is just derivative of that, right? You're externalizing that. You're putting everything in your mouth. You put your hands in your mouth. You put objects in your mouth. You're just trying to replicate that pleasure that's happening. And so as you move from oral to the anal stage, right? So psychosexual development, it's there's a in the transitions, between those stages, it's not a fun time. And we kind of resist each stage. Freud only really took development till puberty. And there's people after him, Jung and Erickson, that looked at whole lifespan development. But if you think about just developing as a person through different stages and through life, no one typically, I mean, maybe some people, but they have a type of resistance and or aversion. There's one of those things of, well, we don't want to get older, or people don't want to be middle aged, or people don't want to be old, or people don't want to leave their 20s or leave their teenage years, or you know I'm being a little bit more casual in how I'm saying this, but we have instinctually, I think, this resistance to the next developmental stage. And at the same time, we want to keep staying, in a broad sense, living life. And so basically, you have these two drives that are warring within you. And that's where again, the life or the eros, right? The libido comes in, right? Because once you get here, then you say, oh, well, a way to survive or to keep staying here in life is to reproduce, or and we see the sexual pleasures in all aspects of things, right? Because it's a way of staying. And but there's a part of us as well that says want to stay, but then also want to return to primordial sense. And so there's this kind of um, push pull kind of thing that's going on intrinsically with each person. Is that a good reframe in your mind?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It gets tricky because we're blending in what you're saying. We're blending this uh, view of life form with or psyche and view of kind of conscious lived life type of thing. And I understand. I
Yeah.
understand what you're saying, and I think it's right. The only thing to pick apart is none of this would be at the level per se of behavior. I mean, it does manifest in behavior, but it's very difficult to tease it all apart and say, here is eros and here is the death drive. And in fact, for Freud, as he developed this you know dual aspect of the drives of life,
Yeah.
his later work after Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, he kind of started to see all of these ways that eros and thanatos are intertwined, which indicates to me, and I'm sure to him, that he didn't quite work all the kinks out of this thing.
Yeah.
But part of the way they're intertwined, just to illustrate it, is part of what you were saying.
Hmm.
So when you consider eros or libido, or to take it more broadly as a principle, when you consider the pleasure principle, which is really what these things are after, is pleasure, like you said.
Yeah.
Sex is, or pleasure is, you could use sex as the quintessential pleasure act.
Yeah.
Sex and pleasure, it's tension reduction. That's what's pleasurable.
Right. Well,
So
if you very specifically think about the act of sex and what happens, there's buildup and then there's release.
right,
It
yeah,
feels very good. I mean, it's not, that's, I mean, very quite literally, that is, and it's so, primal almost, right? So, I mean, that's literally tension reduction in the whole act.
right, yeah. So you've got tension reduction here. There's also ways in which the two intertwine in ambivalent love and the pursuing of the sex object. Right, Freud says that the death drive works in the service of eros, in the pursuing of a sexual object. It wants to dominate the sexual object. It wants to consume in a lot of ways. It wants to, assimilate. And in that sense, life or sex drive is active, you could say. But what is it reaching toward every time? It's reaching toward reduction.
Yeah, it's just trying to
Now,
quell something from
yes,
that's internal. It's this kind of like it's basically it's basically like if you um this is a terribly pedestrian example, but it's like if you have a headache and you take a bunch of Advil, it's like, "Oh, I just want to reduce the headache," and then it's like, oh, okay, I feel better. Like that's again, it's very casual way of explaining that, but in if you scale that in terms of life or you scale it in terms of the instinct, they're just trying to reduce something that's there. It's not a
yeah,
it's not like they're doing that without reduction, right? As if there was if there's no tension reduction, but they're still doing that, right? And in some ways, you could postulate that the tension reduction is the activating thing to then do those things, right? It's the activating force, if you will, to push those things.
yes, yeah, and this gets really tricky because we're standing on nothing here, and what I mean by that is like I said, Freud did not really develop this well,
Hmm.
this side of it well, and frankly, I mean, what he didn't develop is the stuff that would hurt my argument. Perhaps, I'm picking on the point that he makes with eros, that or with reproduction, that it's this reverse directionality. It's this trying to stay. It's this self-preservation in reproduction, this avoidance of development, right? And that is true. I'm not reaching out of bounds there. However, where the issue comes up, and I'm going to have to defend this like crazy in my defense, uh, because I'm at odds with Alan Bass, my advisor, who, by the
Hmm.
way, has written wonderful books on this stuff.
Hmm.
But I have to explain the pesky little part where libido raises tension, right? It is tension, right? That's kind of, if you strip libido down, what is it? It's excitation. That's how the psyche, that's how Freudian psyche sees it. And that is another, I guess to illustrate that further, Freud calls the libido or eros or the reproductive drive, he calls that the mischief maker, right? And so I think, why is it a mischief maker? Because it has this this function of raising tension, pursuing the object of that tension, the object that the tension wants, which the object doesn't matter. It's chosen, right? There's a movable object when it comes to sexuality, the key thing with fetishism and so on. But for him, it's about reduction, and not only is it about reduction, but it's that harkening backward. And then on top of that, just the way he frames it, right? He frames it as mischief maker, as if to say there's this one annoying part of the psyche that is annoying to the psyche, which is a tension reduction machine. It has this one part that works against it. And that's the part that is, libido. So many people have made comparisons between Freud's libido and Nietzsche's will to power as this kind of raw, energetic source. Um, and what would be a really interesting paper, book, I don't know, would be to try to link this libido with this mysterious initial tension excitation in the protozoa, right? This first
Hmm.
instance of life that's brought about. He said he doesn't explain where this excitation comes from. He
Right.
just says you've got an inanimate object. Somehow it developed registration of excitation. There is somehow an excitation and somehow a movement toward reducing
Hmm.
it. So yes, I initially was saying, and I think I even said in the last podcast, Freud's um, Freud's life and psyche is entirely passive, and that's not correct.
Hmm.
Right? But it's also not correct to say that it's active, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because even in this pesky little mischief making, tension increasing part of the psyche, um, like we said, it's about tension reduction. And so it's as if it increases tension just to reduce it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, so the subtle thing to pick on right here at this very point is the difference between tension reduction and the expenditure of power. This
Okay.
is the crux. It's
Yeah.
right here.
Yeah. Expand on
Um,
it. we've hit Nietzsche and Freud in certain ways, and we still have a few other things to get at. But this kind of convergence here, how do you see, or meaning not convergence really, I guess, but a meeting of these two ideas and see how do they hold together or don't? How do you see it?
Yeah, this is where I see the inversion. This is where I see the utter opposition.
Hmm.
Um, you know, even in Freud's most, you might say, active component, the life drive, the libido, the sexual instincts,
Hmm.
even in, this, glaringly odd exception of tension increase, um, the goal is still tension reduction always. And so it's always this reaction to, there's a way to formulate even Freud's instinct in this eruption of an of a cavity, an insertion made on the psyche that was filled with energy, kind of passively,
Mm.
right? You could think of it. I go outside and dig a big hole, and after the spring, it'll fill up with water. And then I have, what do you know, a store of energy that needs to be released.
Hmm.
So there's a way you can formulate Freud's libido, his instinctual charges, even the death drive, right? The death drive requires energy to begin with, to kind of go as a program, if you will. But you could look at this, and Asun, this guy Asun, who wrote a really great book on this, he does look at it this way. It's this eruption, instinctual activity, even sexual instinction, or sexual instinct, reproduction, is a reaction to, if you can imagine it, this insertion in the body, the psyche, this basic life form. Or, well, in this case, it's in the psyche. There's this impression made into the psyche, you could say, a trauma, right? Imagine a foam ball that you punch.
Yeah.
That's really what this is like. And you leave a cavity in it, you leave a hole in it.
Hmm.
And then that cavity gets filled up in the Freudian model with excitation,
Right.
energy.
Right.
And that energy then becomes that which needs to be discharged as instinct. So do you see how it's still a reaction to? It's a cavity filled passively.
Hmm.
So the energy store itself, I'm giving you another option of looking at it. There are a couple ways of formulating this and a couple ways Freud formulates it.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's still always tension reduction. It's still always a retreat. It's another way you can say it. If you just imagine these bodies, the Nietzschean body and the Freudian body, one is constantly retreating. Its only activity, as we said, is in this libidinal reproductive, and that gets twisted up in all kinds of returns.
Hmm.
The expenditure of energy, that is will to power, life for Nietzsche, this expenditure is not reduction.
Yeah.
That's the key thing to recognize. That's the key difference. And I think that's captured in the words themselves. But after expenditure, there is more for Nietzsche. That's how you say it. After reduction, there is less for Freud. And that's the goal. And that points to their essences. In essence, will to power wants more. In essence, Freudian life wants to be less. It wants to not be. It's nihilistic in this sense, very nihilistic.
Yeah.
Nietzsche would have railed against Freud. I mean,
Is there
absolutely.
a way of just for a minute, just while I'm thinking about it, is there a way you? Well, I mean, I guess you could, right? But it's trying to be accurate, and it's just sort of kind of exegesis, with the kind of author's intent in mind and stuff. Like, is there a way where this is maybe not an accurate reading of either one of these guys?
That's funny. Well, yeah, I could be a terrible interpreter. Yes.
No, I don't mean that as an indictment on your approach or how you're reading it, but no, but in terms of like criticism.
Is there another viable
Yeah.
reading? I
Yeah.
don't think so. There are other viable readings of those kind of twists and turns we got caught up in life,
With Freud.
eros for Freud.
Yeah.
That's definitely shaky territory.
Yeah.
However, I think that my overall claim still holds.
Hmm.
Even, as I'm going to have to argue in my defense, there are ways to figure this and to emphasize this tension raising thing and say, look, it's not reductive
Hmm.
because I found this here, right? But I think given the way Freud talks about it, the mischief maker,
Hmm.
the overall directionality of tension reduction, even in libido, it's
Hmm.
still tension, So I think overall you'd have to say, no matter what, even if my particular reading of libido is not correct here, it still doesn't take away my thesis, I don't think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and when it comes to Nietzsche, there are nothing but horrible ways to interpret Nietzsche out there, I think.
Well,
Um,
I was gonna ask you about this. So the deconstructionist and postmodernists, Derrida specifically. I can't remember if I know Deleuze has written a few things on it, and I know I don't know if Lacan had written about Nietzsche or anything like that. But and again, I don't know about Foucault. I don't know about all the deconstructionists and how they've written about Freud or Nietzsche, but I know Derrida has, Deleuze has. I
yeah, so is
imagine
Foucault.
he has. I
Yeah.
want I can't just in understanding how they view power, I can't imagine that um, it doesn't commiserate well with how Nietzsche views power.
Yeah. Well, and to kind of restate your former question, yeah, totally disagrees with what I'm saying. Um,
Mhm.
it's a completely different way of looking, and I don't mean here an inversion like Freud, but so yeah, Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault. I by no means claim to be an expert on these guys. In fact, I kind of avoid them. But I've had to dig into them for this project a little bit, mainly for my defense. But yeah, so Derrida and Deleuze, especially Deleuze, I think did this first. Um, Came along in the '60s with a book on Nietzsche and philosophy. I think '62, and Deleuze is going to he takes some very, what I would consider very strange readings of Nietzsche and emphasize the hell out of them. Um, he's big on this difference notion
Mm,
for Nietzsche. Nietzsche as the philosopher of difference.
mm,
And Derrida picks up on that as well. And in fact, you could say in many respects, from what I gather, that Nietzsche was central for Derrida, Foucault,
yeah,
and
yeah,
Deleuze.
mm,
Not, I mean, he appears, in pretty much every one of their writings and kind of inspired. They would say inspired their style, their approach.
mhm,
Um, but I would say that they are completely misreading Nietzsche.
yes.
It's
I,
very sad.
I don't know.
Um,
I know you haven't read a whole lot of those guys, but in rough terms, how do you see the misreading?
yeah, well, we could point on the two. We could pick on two specific points, and I think these are the main points of misreading. That is Nietzsche as philosopher of difference, and then also issues regarding Deleuze's interpretation of the eternal return. Um, so to go to the first one, um, regarding difference, Deleuze says he looks to the critique or the description that Nietzsche gives of slave and master morality,
Hmm.
and he says, and this is just an instance. He says, look here, what Nietzsche is saying is that the slave is repudiating difference. The slave, much like we said of Freud's life, wants to stay. It wants to remain the same. And I'm pushing what Deleuze is saying. He
Hmm.
says it wants to stay identical. He says it wants to be the opposite of becoming. It wants to be being, right? It wants to be immutable form. It does not want to change. So for this whole notion of Nietzsche as philosopher of difference, they're ascribing this prescriptive and descriptive element to him. And he's coming along and saying, well, no, what's really going on is that the essence of life, the meaning of the earth, is that we embrace difference. So this slave morality is bad insofar as it's repudiating difference. And it wants to stay the same. It does not want to change. Now, they take this one notion, this one aspect, you could say, which is correct. It's a correct aspect. If I read just that, I would be like, okay. But it's where they go with all of this that I think is a big problem. And to present that problematic again, what they're doing, in my estimation, and I don't think this isn't some by the skin of my teeth argument. I could go on for hours about why this is wrong in my view, based off of Nietzsche's text. What they're doing is conflating difference with surpassing. And there's a very important distinction between those terms.
How do you understand it?
So for Nietzsche, right, I'll put it this way. In the beginning of Zarathustra, Nietzsche, or Zarathustra rather, is presented as, he says, taking his ashes into the mountain and contriving there a new flame for himself. Then going down the valley, and as he walks in front of, as he passes the old saint in the forest who doesn't yet know God is dead, the saint, describes for the reader, Nietzsche, or Zarathustra, describes the crucial thing that has happened. He says, behold, Zarathustra is transfigured. A child has Zarathustra become. Long did you wade in the sea, but you dragged your body to shore yourself. Right? He goes on and on. Transfigured is Zarathustra. Now I ask, what went on here? He went up the mountain with ashes. He was ashes. He came down in this glorious fire he contrived for himself. So much so that this old saint, giving us this reader's judgment, describes him as, he surpassed himself. He's transfigured. He's more than, better than, improved in some very specific way. Stronger, more vital, I would say. Now, what happened here? Well, he changed. He's different. He changed. That's what happened, right? Do you see how that doesn't capture what happened at all?
Yeah, not at all. I mean,
he's different,
right?
That doesn't mean anything to Nietzsche. Different for the sake of what is what Nietzsche's on about. So another way I could say this is, difference matters. Difference is required for distinction. Nietzsche says, human, all too human. All too alike are they, the greatest and the smallest. Yeah, he wants mankind, the range that is mankind, to be broader. That is, to have more difference within it. But why?
Right.
We don't stop there. Nietzsche never stopped there. That's a stupid place to stop. It makes no sense. Right? So Deleuze is stopping there and then forcing that view of Nietzsche, the philosopher of difference, not as I would say, which far more captures what Nietzsche is talking about, as the philosopher of surpassing. He's the philosopher of the beyond.
Right.
All right. So difference matters. You don't get a Superman unless there's difference. It's key. It's crucial. But that's not what the Superman is about. The Superman is about surpassing. It's about becoming more, creating beyond yourself. Those things are far more important than difference. Difference serves them. It's a middle term for Nietzsche.
Yeah, it's almost like they stop halfway. They get to the difference and they say, aha, here's the difference. And then their further extrapolation from that is, all of these, different groups with different forms of power, or some with power, some not with power. And then it becomes, oppressor, oppressed, that whole thing. In that way.
Yeah, they answered your question.
Yeah,
They answered your question earlier is there really a prescriptive element to all this? In
Right.
the emphatic affirmative, he hates the powerful.
Right. Right.
That's
Right.
a caricature, but true. That's what they ended up doing with him, which Nietzsche is invariably rolling around in his grave. Like it's, oh, here, let me give this little quip. Derrida says Nietzsche never graduated from difference to difference. Right?
Boy. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, I say Derrida never graduated from difference to surpassing.
Yeah. That's
It
nice.
that's the very thing they're missing in their weird political, oh so contemporary situational interpretation of Nietzsche, application of Nietzsche. Right? They're saying what Freudian decadent life says. I want to be left alone.
Hmm.
Please don't harm me. I'm different.
Right.
Embrace difference. That's what Nietzsche wanted. He
Right.
wanted us to embrace. It sounds like democracy, doesn't
Yeah. Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Or better yet, what it really is it's inclusion.
Mm.
It's the very openness kind of interpretation I think you get onto sometimes with
Hmm.
Nietzsche
Hmm.
is connected to this. And I think I think that is the biggest in terms of Nietzsche scholarship, Nietzsche interpretation as influential in the last century or in the last 50 years. This it's the hugest reading of him. It's had such a big impact on so many different dimensions,
Yeah.
film,
Hmm.
sociology, etc.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, I think it's completely wrong.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm excited and very disappointed
Mm.
because I haven't really read anyone on Nietzsche. I've taken several classes on Nietzsche,
Hmm.
mostly discussion based, focused on just a book. We didn't read other stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and I purposely have tried really hard never to read anything on him. Haven't really wanted to, mostly to try to preserve and come up with my own
Yeah.
views on him. I find him to be that important, to me
Yeah.
to
I,
do
I
that.
I agree in the same way. I think reading secondary sources can sometimes be helpful, um, but whether you want it to or you like it or not, it will just kind of uh, color your view of things, and then it's sometimes hard to like not think about what those ideas are in your head. And so I think trying to stay as pure, with the ideas themselves as possible. There's a whole rant I can have about why people should read original source material, which I'll stay away from at the moment. But yes, I agree with you on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really crucial with Nietzsche. I mean, look, a lot of people need, and I'm not trying to puff myself up here, but like there are things that I would need to read some secondary sources on, especially if I didn't have a lot of time or if I didn't care that much.
Hmm.
Um, with Nietzsche, he's someone that a philosopher that I've just kind of cared about that much, and also that's my general approach. I tend to like to attack texts on their own
Hmm.
terms and see
Yeah.
what can happen. Um,
It's,
when it
so,
comes to Derrida and Deleuze,
yeah.
just to kind of say something quickly on their interpretation of him, if we were to do a Nietzschean critique on that, we would say again, it's so circumstantial. It's
Hmm.
so 1960s.
Yeah.
It's so reactionary.
Yeah.
It's all of these things. And so it makes me wonder, the question I have isn't, wow, what's this brilliant interpretation of Nietzsche? It's, why did they do this? What were they trying to do here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think is the exact question Nietzsche would ask.
Hmm.
What's the aim here?
Hmm.
That's such a terrible interpretation. What's the motive behind it?
Hmm.
And I find that all terrible interpretations have motives behind them.
Yeah. I think that
That's what makes them terrible.
yeah, and I think that's the thing about it is that's why you want to look at, well, especially when you're looking at somebody giving a type of commentary on someone else, you definitely want to look at, okay, you always want to with an original text look at author's intent, but definitely when there's a commentary on someone else, it's like, well, what's the author's intent here? And for folks like Foucault and Derrida, I think it's very clear what their overwhelming biases are, and as a product of their context and time, which they can't really help that, right? I mean, that's not their fault, but it does start to have a lot of influence there, and it's like, okay, again, and I think maybe Derrida more than Foucault. I mean, I mean,
Yeah, Foucault, he seems to be a little better on Nietzsche.
yeah,
Yeah,
but there's less of philosophy and more of just kind of political theory and literary criticism than it is, actual, um, hard nosed kind of philosophy with original ideas. But people might
absolutely.
fight me on that. But
No, absolutely. Well, I think just to take a, a distant view at this, which is really important to do, um, if you take Nietzsche on his own terms, the fact that he was interpreted in such a way that the end result was some sort of social justice movement
yeah,
should
that
tell you right
doesn't really
away
fit.
how far off the mark you are.
Yeah, that does not fit, and you don't even need a very close reading of Nietzsche to know that probably doesn't fit.
Yeah. So, I mean, I honestly like when I said before that I tried not to read anything on Nietzsche for a long time, etc. I
Mhm,
expected to come. I have read quite a bit on secondary sources on Nietzsche now in the last year,
mhm,
and I've found maybe two
mhm,
people who
mhm.
are touching on some essence of Nietzsche in my eyes. Everyone else is using Nietzsche.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's right.
Um,
I agree. I
yeah,
feel the same way. I see a lot of people using his ideas to then filter it through whatever they want to push. And
yeah. And I'm
and
not opposed to that as a
uh,
philosopher, as a creator. I'm not opposed to that as a hermeneutic, as an approach to a text, which is what they're all excited about. It's not interpretation. I mean, it's application, it's imposition.
right.
Um,
Well, and that's maybe I'm a little bit stronger on that. I don't think you can. I mean, you can get application from things, but I think you should try and do the the exposition a little bit of it first, and the hermeneutics first before you start doing any application piece of it, because it's like you know people's ideas, again, how very postmodern, right? You can take things and apply them any way you want. Like, okay, fine. But I think for some things, and maybe for some thinkers or some writers, you want to try and be true to what it's saying. And then you can say, okay, based on the as close as I possibly can, understand what this is saying, then how can I still want to use it for X, Y, and Z purposes?
yeah, yeah. The last step of PBI, right, is
Yeah, yeah.
application.
Yeah, right. That's always it should be last. It
It's,
should be it
yeah,
should be a last step. I agree, but
yeah, yeah. To be charitable, however,
Mhm.
what they're picking up on, and I think rightfully so, although I don't think it's in any way difficult, is Nietzsche's perspectivism, you might say. Nietzsche uses this kind of perspectivism, which people might conflate with relativism, um, but he uses this notion to tear everything down, to shake everything up, to say these immutable uh, constellations of being that have sat in the sky forever are not what they claim to be. Reality is this,
Mhm.
shapeless, ever shaping force, and perspective is what we've got. Um, and all philosophy hitherto has essentially been, what could you say, autobiographical perspective, something like that. So
Right.
these interpreters of the 60s, 70s, 80s, they took that aspect and they said, well,
Mhm.
Nietzsche clearly wants all philosophy henceforth to be philosophy of perspective. And
Right.
I
Right.
think what they're not realizing is, well, that in Nietzsche's hand was a tool for destruction.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is not in Nietzsche's hand a tool per se for building, creating.
Mhm.
It's not really a tool for doing philosophy, doing new philosophy, as Nietzsche would say. These guys think they were the philosophers of the future that Nietzsche was calling toward,
Yeah, and it, and
but
at and at
they're
best
not.
it's right. No, they're not. And at best it's an incomplete. It's like they got the first part of Nietzsche pretty good, right? You read their analysis, it's like, all right, it's tracks. This isn't terrible. This is okay. And then there's like there's that key point, right? Okay, you get the difference, and then it's like, and then it just goes completely, you know, down the shitter after that.
Yeah,
In my
yeah,
opinion.
and no, I think so. But to drive that point home, because you're right, to drive that point home, what happens when you choose? It's as if Deleuze interacted with Nietzsche, found difference, and then it was like a dog to a bone
Hmm.
for
Right.
all the rest of Nietzsche. And so what he ended up having to do is what we would, in the old days call hermeneutical backflips,
Yep.
if you could even call these that. I don't think he landed any of them. And
Right.
that is, he has to squabble with Nietzsche's eternal return,
Hmm.
because Nietzsche's eternal return is the eternal return of the what? The same.
Right.
But Nietzsche is the philosopher of difference, isn't he?
Right.
And so what Deleuze has to do, it appears to me, because I've seen this before, I saw it in seminary, I've seen it in a lot of places. I have a theological notion, a maxim, I will find it
Hmm.
everywhere. And where I find resistance in a particular text, I will stand it on its head with funny little arguments. So what he has to do with eternal return is he says it's not the eternal return of the identical, that is the same like we would say it. It's the eternal return of the same, that is difference. So
Yeah.
he has to literally swap the word for its opposite
Yeah.
and say, well, by same he means ever continuing fluctuation, change.
Hmm.
He means the only thing that stays the same is change, right? That's what Deleuze takes Nietzsche as saying. But that stands in the face of like everything he says on the eternal return.
Well, it doesn't fit on the concepts, right? Again, it is this hermeneutical gymnastics, right? It doesn't stand on the concepts, but then it also just doesn't stand with language, right? And most people know deconstructionists love playing language games. So yeah, those types of things. It's like, okay, again, you can do that, but it just doesn't hold up. And your point is right. I mean, people will find something like it agrees with certain intuitive notions, let's say, and then they just find it and see it in everything. And I think people do that with a lot of ideas and theories outside of philosophy or theology. People do that with a lot
Definitely.
of theory and politics and everything else. um
No, for sure.
um yeah, I mean, you have all of these, a bunch of you know theorists and philosophers on Nietzsche saying this stuff. What is it about, I guess, or is there anything else you want to say about Deleuze and or Derrida and how they're reading this?
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I think concludes my thoughts on this well, and you know, if I could presume Nietzsche's, because I'm using his words, and that is, he says, as I mentioned, I think the first part of this earlier, life always lives at the expense of other life. Then
Hmm.
he goes on, he who does not grasp this has not taken even the first step toward honesty with himself.
There you go. That's
But,
pretty clear and simple in my mind.
yeah, and what I mean by quoting that is to then use Nietzsche to set out as some uh, force against the power structure, against master. Um, and again, as I mentioned earlier, I don't claim to really have a rich understanding of these guys at all. So this is my impression on them, and I do need to do some reading. Unfortunately, when I do this kind of reading, I feel that it makes me less.
Yeah.
It's I don't like to do it necessarily, but you have to really critique with your shoulders back, you might say.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
No,
anyway, yeah, that's
no.
my last point on that. Exploitation is at the essence
Hmm.
uh, of what he says life is. So if you would like to uh, turn Nietzsche into some sort of critique of social inclusion, then you have to also say in the same breath that he stands against the essence of life.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's to read Nietzsche well is to read him in the ways that he at least writes and then how he intends, and then that may make things somewhat challenging and or difficult, or push certain people if they have certain ideas about things already before coming to it. And so that's the
Absolutely. Yeah.
you know that's the epistemic humility that everyone needs when they read stuff. Is okay, let me kind of put some of my intuitions and ideas at the door and just try and read this very openly and see what I can learn and see what I can find. If you just want to put, like, no, that can't be true because I think this or believe this or I want it to be that way, then I don't think that that's probably the most charitable reading of ideas. But
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
me.
And I guess one final thing on that too is there are absolutely ways to get readings, soft readings, you might say,
Hmm.
out of Nietzsche. There are passages where he's overflowing with compassion, almost like a mother toward humanity and
Right. Yeah.
his children and life itself. You will not find anyone, I think, who affirms, uh, embraces life itself. He wants to marry eternity, he says.
Hmm.
Never have I found the woman by whom I want to have children unless it be you, O eternity. He, so it's, he's a philosopher of affirmation.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
say that to juxtapose and with what we were talking about earlier with will to power, just to
Hmm.
kind of bracket that a little bit and say, look, this whole thing that we've been talking about, my thesis, my argument here, it's based on this very rudimentary but not reductive view of the will to power and Freud's tension reduction.
Hmm.
However, that is to say that we've definitely had to leave out all of the subtleties, the nuances in power, which I think you were trying to draw out. And it's just, it took a lot of time and I got distracted, but they're all there. Nietzsche's not this barbarian philosopher per se.
Hmm.
There's a lot of nuance there. So power is all that in response to Deleuze and Derrida. Yeah, you can get the softer side of Nietzsche. Just you don't have to mangle Nietzsche to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I
You have
agree.
to mangle Nietzsche to say it's the emphasis.
Yes. Yeah. That's a very nice way of saying it, actually, because I think that the clearest kind of reading I have on that aspect is just read Human All Too Human. I mean, it's such a wonderful book, and it's very um it does have these more, I guess. I mean, I don't really I understand why people say Nietzsche seems very pessimistic or very tough, and very harsh, but he has so many lighter sides to him. And Human All Too Human, that book, I think you see a lot of that. It's early Nietzsche, but it is still really good Nietzsche. So um,
Yeah, and I can also see how you can derive this notion of inclusion from the notion of the Superman. That is the affirmation of whatever is next, and don't be
mhm,
traditional. And
mhm, mhm.
you can do that.
Yeah.
It's and it has passed in it's passed as good reading in brilliant minds far more brilliant than mine, I'm sure. So
Mhm.
how that all happens, I don't know.
Yeah.
There are brilliant scholars of the New Testament and also brilliant scholars of the Torah and so on. All these geniuses in disagreement.
Mhm, mhm. Right.
However, to kind of, again, I know I'm not wrapping this up, but I think it's important.
It's okay. No, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
um, it's about interpretation. These guys were right when they said will to power is interpretation. But again, they kind of stopped there. Um, and, so is there a better reading than another? Is there a better reading of Nietzsche than another? Many people who I think do a very surface reading of Nietzsche would say, well, he doesn't even allow that sort of thing.
Mhm.
I think that's definitely false if you read him closely. If you take for granted his project, he would certainly say there are good readings and bad readings. And in fact, I think such is very obvious in Zarathustra with the child in the mirror.
Yeah.
When he has a dream after leaving his disciples, having taught them a bunch, and says, "Can I go do your thing? I'm leaving."
Mm-hmm.
He wakes up from a dream up in his cave, and I think how it goes is a child approaches him with a mirror in the dream, and he looks at his face, and his face is all distorted. And so he has to run back to the earth, back down the mountain, become a man again to correct his doctrine so that he is not confused with others. And who does he say? You know, that's what I think needs to happen now. If Nietzsche were to be resurrected today, I think he would write The Child in the Mirror, a century of misreading Nietzsche, something like that, you know.
I could see that.
Yeah.
So
So that's that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it is important, and again, maybe one day you and I can kind of do some dust off the cobwebs and talk about the importance of, you know, hermeneutics appropriately and stuff like that. Or this is a side note. One day we should, you know, talk about Gadamer, truth and method, because he does a lot of that stuff, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think it would be great. Actually, you and I would have a good talk on hermeneutics and interpretation.
Yeah. Okay, so just I want to do last point, eternal recurrence of the same, and then but I before we get there, just one other thing I wanted to highlight is I can't remember if I think we sort of talked around it or whatever, but I don't know if we hit it directly, which was um, this idea I think definitely, you know, kind of endogenous to Nietzsche's philosophy, and in another way for Freud too, is this idea of pleasure and pain, right? So that comes about in Freud for sure, but Nietzsche also talks about pain and suffering, and he doesn't really like happiness in the way that. Well, I mean, I don't want to say he does or doesn't like it, but he doesn't talk about it in the way that most people would see it as like a goal or whatever in common modern life. You know, so in terms of, I can't recall if we talked about the pleasure and pain aspects. I know we did a little bit
No,
with
we didn't really touch on it. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit with the
And it is really important too.
life
So.
and death instinct with Freud. But so maybe let's get into that before we do eternal recurrence.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. And this will work really well for those listening at this point in the conversation.
Yeah, for
It will
those
make
that
a lot
have
of
really
sense.
endured. Yeah, really endured
Yeah.
you know, how much time we put into this thus far.
Exactly. Well, yeah, you see it. I'll start with Freud. With Freud, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, again, 1920, he begins his theorizing really right upon the death of Nietzsche, right around 1900. He published a little bit before that, but so in 1920 he comes along and he's revising his theory of the instincts. He's going to pose life and death instincts as opposed to libido versus self-preservation or the ego, was kind of the formulation before. So Freud goes on and he says, you know what, in order to do this, we really first need to correct or lock down our view of pleasure and pain. And he goes back to Fechner's tendency towards stability. Fechner's a philosopher back during his time. I think he died somewhere around right before the turn of the century. Anyway, he has this tendency towards stability. So the pleasure principle is, and still is after Freud's reformulation, the pleasure principle is based on Fechner's tendency towards stability. So you imagine it's this excitation meter, which has a baseline of nothing. Again, just tracing this notion we've talked about of inanimate life, the nirvana principle, emptiness, death, no tension, no excitation. And then, so that is ultimate pleasure, really, for Freud. And then everything that tends toward the reduction of tension is pleasurable.
Right.
That's how he defines pleasure. It's this. That's why pleasure can be relative. So can pain. because it's a tendency toward this kind of ever-moving equilibrium, this point in the middle, by which everything is judged somatically, psychically as pleasure or pain, or I guess that's linguistically, but you know what I mean. So in the event of a trauma, as we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
a trauma is a force of excitation, exterior excitation, that is so great that it damages the body,
Right.
the psyche, you would say.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that event, right, what the damaging aspect, you could say the painful, the injury, is that trauma is it's an increase, a dangerous, an injurious increase in tension. So, for instance, I'm walking around and there's air going across my skin and it's increasing stimulation and excitation in that sense. But my my psyche is equipped with countercharges, Freud says, that can easily handle that sort of thing and are set up to do so. Whereas, and this gets interesting here, Freud says in the shock neurosis, or in what we would call now PTSD,
Right.
or some variation of that. In the war neurosis, I believe he calls it, what's going on there is that the countercharge in the psyche was not set up properly for or to handle the excitation that was forced into it in a traumatically forced, right? This is a trauma. So, for instance, somebody, he says, who's prepared, right? They have this countercharge set up, apprehension of the danger before this event, trauma, this attack, you could say. They have their defenses up before it happens. And he says, in that case, really, no matter what is going on, it's not going to lead to a neurosis because there's this prior apprehension. There's this buildup of a countercharge against increased excitation, against pain, is what it really is, psychic pain. Right. So, however, he says, and this is where it's important. He says, Schreck in German, fear or fright, fright, where you're surprised, where it's this thing where you are not prepared psychically. You do not have an adequate countercharge built up for this thing. It takes you by surprise. And then, boom, the bomb goes off, or however the trauma occurs. Then he says you develop the war neurosis. And what happened there is that the excitation, the trauma, was too much for the psyche to handle, which led it to go into the psyche. Right? It's this whole notion of reception and defense. The psyche does not want to receive the exterior stimuli. It builds up a countercharge. And pain is when that unfortunately happens, regardless of the countercharge and the preparation. So again, what it always goes back to is an increase in excitation is experienced as painful. A decrease in excitation is experienced as pleasurable. And that right there is giving you the basis of the pleasure principle and also tension reduction, right? And so we see that even in sex or those types of pursuits, what's really going on is tension reduction. So
there's like a inadvertently a dichotomy that's happening where it's pleasure is stability, pain is instability. That's a very reductionistic way of saying it, but to clarify, to seek pleasure is to reduce tension or to have tension reduction. Hence, tension reduction causes some kind of dissonance, right? There's warring factions, and that's unstable. And so to have stability, you need to reduce it. And how do you reduce it? You have the pleasure, right? You activate the pleasure, and that has the stability. The pain is going to, only increase that even further. And so the pain can be some type of instability.
Yeah. And another thing that kind of illustrates this and ties it into all the other stuff, the evaluation of Freud, you might say, is Freud also says, well, it's not quite right to say that we pursue pleasure or the pleasure principle. Really, it's the avoidance of pain,
Yeah.
which again just gives you his framing that he does
Yes.
over and over again. It's not a necessary framing, but
Right.
he goes to great lengths to frame it that way as tension reduction.
Mm-hmm.
So the important thing in this comparison of Nietzsche Freud with their notions of pleasure pain, but which also resonates through all of the other comparison and inversions going on, is that pleasure for Freud is a decrease in tension. Pleasure for Nietzsche is an increase in power. It's an increase in tension.
Mm-hmm.
So what is pleasure for Nietzsche? He says it's the assessment that you've gained power, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
It's this somatic psychic registration of this situational increase in power or energy, or Freudian terms, tension. And you can see just in the use of the terms, because they are talking about energy in this neutral way.
I was going to say, they're
Like,
both talking about pleasure. They're just talking about it in different ways. They both acknowledge its importance. They both acknowledge its existence, but they're just seeing it in different ways.
yeah, well, I mean, specifically on tension versus power.
Okay.
It's two ways of saying the same things, really, for these guys. Like, if you take them on their own terms, it's not a one-to-one comparison, but they're really saying that's their same term for them. But they frame it as one, we call it something negative. It's tension.
Mm-hmm.
That's a negative word. That's how we use it. The other one calls it power, which what I meant was they're both referring to this neuter term energy. One calls it tension, one calls it power, showing that one wants it to decrease, one wants it to increase. And their formulations of pleasure, pain, psyche, life, etc., match that. My thesis, I would say, is really I'm defending a consistent thread, a consistent essence throughout their work. And definitely to the expense or at the expense of those parts that don't, hold such an opposition, which are certainly there. But anyway, you see with pleasure pain that at the very fundament of their formulations, we could even say of their problematics. What does Nietzsche see as a problem? Decrease in vitality. It's another way of saying decrease in tension. The tension of the bow, he says. Right? He's talking about, life standing there, or mankind still, is there tension enough in your bow to shoot a good shot and kill something, or hit the target, or whatever, hit the target, whatever that is, to posit a target and hit it, to want a target. He says, it's great to want, but it's even better, at first to know that you do want something. And that's, that's kind of hitting at it, right? It's not that you want to go back. It's not that you want to be the last man and stay. It's that you want something that you don't have, that you perhaps can't have in your current state. And so you have to surpass yourself to get it. But so for Nietzsche, and I think this is a really important part of it, when I achieve some sort of victory, which is this movable, as nuanced as possible term, when I achieve that, it's via expenditure, like I said earlier. It's via this release of excitation, tension, in a Freudian term. But the result of it is an increase in power, the situational assessment. And oddly enough, to get kind of deep for a second, it's not just an assessment, it's also real. It's like the assessment makes it real. It's kind of strange. So there's a lot to get into there, which Nietzsche never got into, which no one, as far as I can tell, has gotten into, because everyone went on these like weird offshoots.
Detours, yeah, they got on the rabbit trails, yeah.
Right.
No, I think that's right, and I think it's an interesting there's like a I kind of think of it like a zig and a zag kind of thing, right? Between with Freud and Nietzsche on these issues. Like they're overlapping and then they're diverging and then they're overlapping again. And there's like this weird kind of rhythm they have with this stuff. Um,
Absolutely.
it's just it's
Yeah.
super interesting. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, tagging on that, it
Yeah.
absolutely is true to say, like Thomas Mann did, I believe, that
Hmm.
Nietzsche uh, laid the foreground for what Freud developed.
Hmm.
However, I hope that we've illustrated at this point that it's also absolutely true, and more so to say that what they elaborated was essentially opposite,
Hmm. Hmm.
not in topic, not in thinghood, not in concept, but in the content.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think, that's really what I'm trying to get across. That's what's confused everyone, is my argument.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it's very solid. I mean, it's very clear. I mean, in my mind, to see it that way. So let's last topic is eternal recurrence of the same on Nietzsche's end of things. Um, this is always a hard one for me. It's a hard concept for me always to get. I either feel like I have a really you know, elementary understanding of it, but I feel like there's some depth to it that I'm missing. So, how do you understand this, and then we can compare it again with or juxtapose it with Freud.
Well, eternal return for Nietzsche suffers from this, and I say suffer kind of cheekily.
Hmm.
He suffers from this malady as someone who's interpreted of being really, really subtle in some ways, and people then assuming that everything is just jam packed full of subtlety.
Hmm.
Um, and to an extent, that's true with Nietzsche. That's why I like him. He's very
Hmm.
difficult.
Hmm.
Um, However, he's no Jean-Paul Sartre. He's no Heidegger, right
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
He's not. This isn't the Book of Revelation.
Right.
Nietzsche's writing is very accessible, perhaps to a certain kind of hermeneutic, which
Hmm.
I think is probably much like his own, and that's an interesting thing. But when it comes to the eternal return, there have been a lot of views on it. In fact, I can think of three right now.
Okay.
Um, and I'm sure that's not all. That is the interpretation I put forward, which is probably similar to what would be the classical interpretation, although I don't know if that's necessarily true. And I'm thinking of Kaufman. And that would be that the eternal return is just like he says, it's the eternal return of the same. When you sit in the thought experiment or the parable or narrative form of this he gives, it's the evil demon comes to you, and the demon comes to you and says, I guess this is somewhat modeled after Descartes, but comes to you and says, would you affirm if I told you, or how would you react if I? It just says, if I told you this demon came to you in the night and says every little thing, and I think he even says like a lonely night, a despairing night, and says everything you've experienced. He's attacking you in your weakest hour. Everything you've experienced, even this recent terrible suffering, you will have to experience over and over, and every little tiny grueling detail. Um, how would you react to that? Would you say, yes, you are God? I am. Again, let's do it again. Um, or would you curse, uh, the messenger and curse your life and reject your life? So for Nietzsche, eternal return touches on all kinds of dimensions, but this is one dimension, and that is the dimension of, I would call it, amor fati. Right? This is the dimension in which he's constantly prescribing uh, the affirmation of fate, the love of fate. your own fate, specifically and identically, right? The whole notion hinges on the wish that nothing be different.
Mm.
And so, my interpretation of this, right? And let's switch it to another dimension. This is modeled after Heraclitus's Toros Tropai, the turnings of fire.
I was going to say, I wrote a note down when I was preparing for us to talk today. I was like, this sounds like Heraclitus fire. And
Yeah, exactly. Heraclitus poses this cycle by which he says all is fire, right? It's this physicalist model,
Mhm.
in which he says, the universe is eternal and it's eternally going on this cycle. And importantly, it's preserving. It's a perfectly economical, necessary cycle, right? So Nietzsche comes along and says, yes, this is my great eternal return. And guess what? One other guy in all of history, one other person, one other philosopher might have already taught it, and that's Heraclitus. And what he's talking about is his turnings of fire along this cycle.
This is in
Now,
Twilight of the Idols. Where does he mention this? He does mention Heraclitus in Twilight of the Idols. Is that right? I can't remember.
yeah, and in Will to Power,
Uh-huh.
he's in a couple places. I think he's even in Ecce Homo.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think actually you find him in the gay science too, if I'm not mistaken. That you don't find a lot on Heraclitus, although Nietzsche, there's books published recently. Nietzsche's lectures on ancient Greek philosophy, on specifically the pre-Platonics, which are wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful. There's two of them: ancient Greek philosophy and the pre-Platonics is the other one. Anyway, he wrote quite a bit on Heraclitus in there. All that to say, the eternal return of the same ought to be seen, in my estimation, and I think this is easy to back up in Nietzsche, as the temporal aspect of will to power. Right? He says that the eternal return marries mechanistic view of thinking, which he says is an idealist view, and the Platonic view, which he says is an idealist view. And what he means by that is it's marrying being and becoming. And and this is important because it's a cycle. As a cycle, which recurs, as this thing which continually, he says, the ring of eternity rolls, right? It rolls desirously toward itself. So there's this teleology in it, and it gets complicated. But for Nietzsche, will to power is this differential of power between all of these constituent wills in the cosmos.
Right.
Inanimate, animate, all going on constantly. A Heraclitean universe of war. Right? That's what he's got in mind. These fighters everywhere going at it, even to the atomic, perhaps beyond the atomic level. And so this gets a little bit complicated, and I'll try to do it clearly. Nietzsche says the universe is not infinite. Infinity, he says, is a weakling's concept. It's how you get out of everything. It's not a concept in reality. It's not a thing, right? Not to say that time is a thing per se, but there is no infinite. Right? However, so Nietzsche forms his cosmology by saying everything is finite. Right? And by that he means the universe is finite. There's a finite amount of things that we could say are able to be a representative of will to power, put it that way. So then he says they unceasably fight back and forth. Right? It's this will to power, this constant flow of Eris throughout the cosmos, perpetuating what Deleuze and Derrida would like to touch on: difference, constant change, constant flux, really more like Heraclitus is becoming. And so if we track with this, you have finitude, the universe is finite. a finite amount of stuff interacting. Think of relations. There's a finite amount of relations because there's a finite amount of stuff. However, he says it's a cycle that goes on forever, never had a beginning, never has an end, never began to become, and so on, because it's will to power, which could have no beginning. There's no first motion for Nietzsche, just as there's no first motion on Heraclitus's wheel, the turnings of fire. And so you have the cosmos is finite. Then you have this cycle by which everything repeats and nothing is lost. He says the cosmos is a writhing mass. No energy is lost. It's all just transferred forever. And so, but not just that. He says it goes along the specific cycle because everything is necessary. In this way, he is a firm proponent of something like a fatalistic. It's a necessary flow. It follows the same trail, not every time, because, and this is crucial, if you have finitude in eternal motion, you get return of the identical infinite times. So everything that could happen has happened an infinite amount of times and will happen an infinite amount of times. Nietzsche says such that that nothing stops him from standing, looking forward and looking backward and saying he could not ever reach the end, right? And that all along this same line, forward and backward, there are whatever happens next there's no way in which you can formulate finitude in eternal, transferential, differential relationship, spanned over eternity in this cycle without ending up mathematically, logically, however you'd like to say it, in this eternal return of the same. So I say all that to say there's a whole, and that's not all. There are a bunch of ways Nietzsche supports this whole thing. It's not just this amor fati. It's not just this embracing of Heraclitean flux. It's the embrace of the identical. It's the embrace of exactly who you are and exactly who you will make yourself to be, perhaps, or not.
Right.
But those who don't make themselves something don't have the vitality to even conjure, he would say, or accept this notion, or be happy about it, to be delighted in it. This is where it comes back to this application. Nietzsche's very prescriptively saying, be the sort of person who finds this beautiful, while at the same time knowing all of your faults, guilts, shame, inadequacies, etc., suffering. The eternal return echoes this beautiful line of Nietzsche that says, he says in The Gay Science, I try to see everything that's necessary as beautiful.
Yeah.
And and what he means in this context, this is what eternal return is about. Eternal return is seeing not just this life, but every possibility, and specifically this one that you're living, as beautiful. Because, and this is key, because for Nietzsche it's necessary. That's why he says over and over again, I am necessary. That is, so he's always fighting against this notion of free will and intention. That's why this is very difficult to apply to personal life as kind of a way to improve people, because Nietzsche's saying, look, you're not going to educate someone to be better necessarily. Like, that's not quite true. But if they become better, it's because they have what it took to be better before you educated them. So it gets tricky. But he says, and to drive this point home of the identical, he says in his notes, I believe, he says, even mother and sister, with all of their resentment, right? And he's talking about his mother and sister.
Yeah.
He's going to have to endure even mother and sister again. And he's trying, It's not that he says he succeeded,
Mm-hmm.
to find that beautiful, because
Mm-hmm.
it's necessary. They're
Mm-hmm.
necessary. The
Mm-hmm.
relationship they have is necessary.
Yeah.
Um, and at the same time, to get super nuanced, that's not a recipe or an instruction to nihilism and I shall not do anything or try to change the
Right.
things. It's a very difficult concept to grasp, I guess, but all that to say, it's a very complex idea. Its application is complex.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that it is description primarily is complex. Um,
But
but
it feels also like this is somewhat of where, Heidegger picked up the torch here, and he tried to do that. I mean, he tried to lay all that out in his way, and there's I think as brilliant as Heidegger was, he doesn't always read Nietzsche accurately. I don't think he reads him as inaccurately as Derrida and Deleuze and some of those guys do, but
yeah,
Heidegger has his own framing. He has his own structure that he sees things through, but I do think he does on this point try to make it commiserate in some ways. But yeah.
yeah, and he's another guy that I've kind of neglected, so I won't talk too much on him. But undoubtedly, he's going to have one of these other kind of takes on it. Because the second way you can view eternal return is like we said earlier with Deleuze. Deleuze sees it as no, the return of flux. It's perpetual flux, which it is.
Mm-hmm.
He just misses the point that it's perpetual flux, which, by the way, given finitude and eternal fluctuation, will inevitably reproduce, recapitulate, return to these identical things. And Nietzsche even says in a series, right? It's like if we let a crazy long algorithm go, not that I'm a mathematician, but if we develop this very complicated algorithm and we let it go, for Nietzsche, which let's say this thing doesn't repeat for, I don't know, 10 to the 10 power iterations. Nietzsche's saying that, okay, that's cool, but it's not an irrational number. It's not something that doesn't resolve. The universe resolves. It goes back. It goes back, and so that huge algorithm that goes and goes and goes and goes and goes, he says at a certain point, must, by the factors we laid out, start the cycle again. So it's not just return of the same amid this crazy, chaotic repetition, eternal, iterations of things. It's the repetition of the identical along the same cycle. So it's a very, very long cycle of repetition. However, since it's eternal, it doesn't matter because everything that has happened will happen an infinite amount of times. Is the point.
Right.
Now, Deleuze comes along and says, no, that's not what that means, right? Like I said, he says it means eternal return of the same that is difference. We went over that earlier. Another view, which is the last one I'll touch on, says that this is just a parable. And they say it like that too, which should send off a whole lot of alarms immediately.
Yeah, it's a little weird.
But I get it a little bit. In fact, Rick Roderick, who I like quite a bit, he's got some cool videos on stuff. Mm-hmm. He takes this view. It's a thought experiment. It's a parable, and the meaning of a parable is never what it says, right? And so he doesn't actually mean this, right? He's a guy who doesn't really like logic and system, and he certainly doesn't like the return of the same thing over and over. That sounds like no Superman and no progress and no, all of these kind of bad readings of Nietzsche. So there's a reading that just highlights, emphasizes his application, prescription aspect of the eternal return. Something worthy of worship. Why? Because it's linked to Amor Fati, really. Mm-hmm. And that view probably highlights the freedom, acceptance, consolation, Nietzsche even says, is given It's the only place you see anything like that, really, for Nietzsche.
Hmm.
The eternal return is also consolation. It's also, like I said, worthy of reverence for Nietzsche.
Hmm.
Now, to do our last, big juxtaposition, and to say, something to paint this for Freud quickly. For Freud, the return of the repressed is always this. So it's positive in the sense that life wants to go back, right? But that, is this nihilistic positivism. But it's negative in this applicational sense.
Yeah.
Because the
Right.
patient comes into Freud. What are they suffering from? They're suffering mainly from reminiscences. They're suffering from pleasures which cannot be experienced as
repressed
such.
memories in the unconscious.
Yeah, and so the goal of psychoanalysis through repetitive, painful transference is to exhaust this transferential material, to bring it to consciousness. That is, to make it accessible to consciousness, basically. And but my point in all of this is that if you look at return, right, return is only positive. And that's not even really the right word, but it's only positive for Freud in the sense that the life drive specifically, and you could say also the life form itself wants to return. Right? That's kind of what it's doing in reinstating an earlier condition in reproduction. However, every other aspect of return is this painful thing. The repetition compulsion is the essence, Freud says, of the death drive. It's this repetition compulsion tension reduction. That kind of thing is what's going on. Whereas for Nietzsche, repetition is this thing that you embrace. And to touch on one other mode of repetition for Nietzsche too, repetition for Nietzsche in terms of an obstacle, to be more specific, in terms of the overcoming of an obstacle, is what gives someone, the highest charge of power. So there's this, it's not just I win a war against a giant monster, it's I fight 100 monsters. I return over and over again to this battle. And in so doing, I can develop this enormous, subtly considered, positionally considered energy, power. So, again, in return, you see this inversion between these guys. To put it into therapeutic terms, the return of the repressed is what patients suffer from for Freud. And so they must return over and over and over, perhaps interminably to therapy, right? All of this negative, painful, repressed material must be, that's what therapy is. It's a repetitious return and reliving of memory. There's like 5 returns in there. And sometimes they even stack on top of each other.
Yep.
And this is juxtaposed in the final application with Nietzsche's consolation. He's saying the fact that everything happens, even the bloody, even the painful, even the beautiful and the pleasurable, all of it, the fact that all comes back again and again and again and again in this ecstatic return, he says that's a consolation. It's not something negative. It's something, it's the highest good, in kind of a Platonic way.
Right.
That's how he affirms the universe, is through eternal return.
That's really good, and it does clarify things for me, at least me personally, and it is still, I think, one of the most complex or layered of his ideas, the eternal recurrence. It's a tough one. So
definitely, yeah. He actually has something, a little aphorism, or it's published as an aphorism in The Will to Power, which he didn't publish, right? It's just a collection of his notes, etc.
Right. Right.
But he has a note in there outlining a book on the eternal return
Yeah.
that he
Yeah.
never wrote.
It's frustrating. It's yeah, that
But
and the revaluation of all values. Like, oh man, it would have been amazing what he would have written.
yeah, yeah,
I guess let's so I mean, I feel like we could keep going and going and going, but I feel like we've exhausted um in really fine detail these big points, the points that you lay out. I mean, obviously your whole the thread of this is your main thesis, which I think is great. So maybe just briefly, I don't want to be too redundant, right? Because you did a wonderful job in the beginning of summarizing, but maybe like the the 5 minute version or whatever of the just kind of a summary of all the things that we've touched on in the conversation.
yeah. Well, I'll do my best. We touched on like a million things, but I think
Yes.
as assuming we stayed somewhat close to what we were trying to, with the historical relation, the Nietzsche Freud connection is very telling. Right? It's revelatory and parallel
Hmm.
to what I think is the essential relation or difference between their theories. And we see this in the historical relation between Nietzsche's work and the development of psychoanalysis in the way that Nietzsche handled Freud. Freud rather, as kind of the embodiment of his theory, you might say at this point, uh, was very averse to Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a nobility he couldn't access, he says. And so he avoids Nietzsche, says he could never read more than a half a page of him. And
Hmm. Hmm.
in his autobiography, I think he says he never read him at all. He avoided Nietzsche as if some sort of tension increasing object. And then he goes on to say Nietzsche couldn't have said what he said. He must have been sick. No one else could be like him. We all must do psychoanalysis.
Right.
And that's my particular reading, but I think it's there. Now, all that to say, Nietzsche's been considered, right, and was the forerunner of Freud, and I think his historical relation that we unpacked shows that, sure, there's lots of ways he was the forerunner. Like you said, they talk about the same thing, often in totally opposed ways. However, that opposition was never fleshed out. It was denied. It wasn't really seen for a long time. In fact, I've never really seen it quite seen. The work by Assoun, Freud, and Nietzsche, kind of a landmark work. He draws it out in there, but not really explicitly. Um, so moving into their theory again, we see that in their theories of life are opposed. Right?
Hmm.
Life for Freud is essentially taken as a totality, this thing which wants to reinstate an earlier condition, and ultimately, since its inevitable result is death, the goal of life is death. Freud said. Life for Nietzsche, on the other hand, is this amalgamation of wills to power set in this vital arrangement. And, it proceeds, as does will to power, toward expenditure and accumulation. And that's what life is. Life is, for Nietzsche, a particular kind of death, a particular kind of will to power, a rare kind, which he sees human life in the modern day as particularly degenerate and dangerously going backward, or running the risk of such things via a kind of Freudian model of life, kind of Freudian perspective. Like the last man is Freudian perspective. I want to stay, resisting development.
Hmm.
Um, so their instincts reflect this, their notion of the instincts. For Freud, you've got the Thanatos and Eros. You've got these drives that one goes back and seeks to destroy and break apart. The death drive seeks ultimately this nirvana, this peace in animation. The before, always the before, and always a return. always and away from. So all the instincts for Freud are conservative. Even they, in their
Yeah.
explosive pressure, want to go back. Nietzsche, on the other hand, his instincts are these collections of will to power. And so naturally, they want what will to power wants, perhaps in their own particular way. Expenditure, accumulation, always more, further, toward. It's always a free for Nietzsche, whereas for Freud, it's always a free from.
Yes.
And that's a key distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, with their notions of return, it's again, reversals everywhere. For Freud, the return of the repressed is the main, source that he tries to exercise in therapy through transference.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the main motor of the therapy. And whereas, and people suffer mainly from reminiscences, he says, this return to the past. For Nietzsche, however, as we were just saying, the eternal return of the same is kind of the glorification, the deification of return itself.
Mm-hmm.
And he poses it as consolation. So there's that. I did want to say, one piece, and perhaps you'll say this next on, so what, or like what next kind of thing. And that, I know that I don't want to make that too long, but
I guess my question on that would be, what do we do with this? Is kind of what how I'd frame it.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I wanted to go. And I'll say at the outset, I didn't do this project because I don't like Freud and I wanted to see some destruction and opposition or something.
Mm-hmm.
I did this project because I'm really interested and have been in a Nietzschean psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really interested specifically in emphasizing that that ever active, ever pursuing essence of the cosmos in a psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And as I started to get familiar with Nietzsche's cosmology and consequently his psychology,
Mm-hmm.
I started to notice at the same time the opposition in Freud. But then I noticed at the same time how much everyone says that Freud finished what Nietzsche started. And, so what is, if we're ever going to unpack Nietzsche as the philosopher, the psychologist who preceded Freud and really did all of this heavy lifting before him, which is true. The id is Nietzsche. Freud took that from Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
And Nietzsche had the unconscious, the decentering of the subject, the lack of centrality and importance and consciousness, and etc. Like all of this stuff was there. Even Freud's dream theory was kind of there in Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, we go back to archaic forms of life and our dreams. It's all there for Nietzsche. But to see him without Freud, I think, is a necessary step next. And I think that doing what I did in my mind was necessary for me to move forward with Nietzsche as a psychologist, perhaps using some of Freud as kind of a guide, like, hey, you can do this. It strikes me, and always has, that you could take like a Euclid's geometry. You can adjust the fifth postulate, and man, crazy stuff happens.
Right.
You get parallel lines that gradually never touch but approach, infinite, intersection,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. Now, the same is true, it seems to me, for a system like Freudian psychology. It's a huge, massive system built on a couple premises and definitions, axioms, etc. And what he's doing is running all of these propositions through it. That's kind of what we do. And Freud's system is really, he might even object, and did, to the notion of a system, but it is. It's this economy, this dynamic, this psychic apparatus for Freud. is this, like we've been saying, passive reactive system. However, I think, like we were saying too, since they talked about all the same things almost, just in different ways, I think that we can take a Freudian psychology, just for a place to start perhaps, and make it active and see what happens. Take all of those things out and reverse it. Reverse the rule of passivity. Reverse the rule of tension reduction. Make it will to power. What happens then? What does it look like?
Mm-hmm.
Do you ruin half of it? I don't think so. I think it just takes on a different directionality and leads to different results. I think their psychologies are like that. But first, what I wanted to do and why I think this was important is I want to show their opposition, first and foremost, to separate Nietzsche from Freud so that we can see him first. And then I really am curious, since Freud developed psychology further than anyone, Nietzsche included, I am curious to see how a Nietzschean Freudian psychology would look like. That is to say, one where you swap Freud's nihilism with Nietzsche's vitalism. So perhaps a dissertation coming in a year or so. I don't know.
Yeah.
If anyone wants me to write books on this, let me know. I got an email and stuff.
Yeah,
I'm just ready to go.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love the idea, and I think it's I mean, absolutely there's so much there that you could use with that, and it would be interesting to see that explored and at greater length. So, yeah. Okay, well, look, Tyler, we did almost 4 hours, and that was super fun. I think that is again, for me, having a conversation about these two guys in a accurate and hopefully clear way is super, super important. And I really hope for everyone that listens, they really, get something out of it. I hope so. I can't thank you enough for all of your time and your mind and your energy. It was too much fun.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the opportunity to wax, hopefully somewhat eloquent on these topics. Also, even though your audience might not know, he's helping me with my defense in a few days. So I will not do what I just did, but at least I worked through some of the things, and I appreciate the help with that.
Yeah,
That's huge.
no, it was super awesome. So it's very, very good authoritative stance on it. So it's wonderful. So again, always more to get into at a future date, and I'm sure we'll keep doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. On to the next project. And again, thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody for listening too. Appreciate it.
All right, man. Thanks.